At my parents' 40th anniversary dinner, my younger sister stood up, raised her crystal champagne glass, and announced to the entire room that I was 35, single, and totally embarrassing. My mother laughed the loudest, but they had no idea that very soon the restaurant doors would open, and a billionaire they had spent years insulting would walk straight up to me, kiss my hand, and reveal exactly why I had been keeping our engagement a secret until that very night. My name is Sarah Bennett. I am 35 years old. For the past 10 years, I have served as the chief accountant and the only certified public accountant for our family transportation brokerage company in Chicago. I say served because working for my family was never just a regular job. It was an absolute life sentence. It was a Friday night at Le Petit Chateau, a restaurant so exclusive and expensive that securing a reservation took an entire year. The private dining room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. 50 of my parents' closest friends, elite business partners, and wealthy socialite neighbors sat at tables draped in heavy white linen. I did not have a seat at any of those beautifully decorated tables. I was standing in the dark shadows near the swinging kitchen doors, holding a glass of cheap tap water, wearing a plain black dress I had bought on a clearance rack 5 years ago. I was the one who had booked this room. I was the one who had spent the last 3 weeks agonizing over the dinner menu, negotiating prices with the expensive florists, and making sure the string quartet arrived exactly on time. I did all of this while working 60 hours a week to manage the payroll and balance the books for the family business. I fought with the vendors, I managed the federal audits, and I stayed awake until 2 in the morning, reconciling ledgers, because my brother-in-law could not be bothered to keep his receipts. I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the invisible daughter. In the center of the room, soaking in the admiration of the crowd, was my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was 32 years old, wrapped in a shimmering designer silk gown that probably cost more than my car. Beside her sat her husband, Trent. Trent was a tall, incredibly smug man who served as the chief executive officer of our company. He was given that title the day he married my sister. He had zero experience in logistics or management, but my father, Richard, adored him. Since early childhood, the rules of the Bennett family were clear. Chloe was the golden child. She was beautiful, charming, and demanded the best of everything. I was the workhorse. When Chloe wanted to go to a private university out of state, my parents remortgaged the house to pay it. When I got accepted to a prestigious accounting program, my mother, Patricia, told me it was too expensive and I should just go to the local community college so I could stay home and help with the household chores. I accepted it. I accepted all of it. I told myself that families help each other. I told myself that my hard work would eventually be recognized and rewarded. I poured my entire soul into the company fixing Trent's disastrous financial mistakes, covering up his lazy management, and keeping our family business afloat. I drove an 8-year-old Honda with a broken air conditioner. I lived in a cramped, drafty apartment. I sacrificed my own future, my own happiness, and my own savings so they could live in luxury. The string quartet finished playing a soft classical piece. The room quieted down. Chloe stood up from the head table. She picked up her champagne flute and tapped it gently with a silver spoon. The delicate chiming sound brought all conversation to a complete halt. Everyone turned to look at her. She smiled her perfect, expensive smile. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about our parents and their 40 years of supposedly perfect marriage. She talked about the importance of family love and success. Then her eyes scanned the room and locked onto me standing in the corner. Her smile shifted into something sharp, calculated, and incredibly cold. And a round of applause for my older sister, Sarah Chloe, announced her voice carrying loudly through the silent room. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger right at me. Everyone turned to stare. I felt a sudden rush of heat rise in my cheeks. She is 35. Chloe continued, her tone dripping with mock pity. Still hopelessly single, still driving that old Honda, and still just a lowly employee working for our dad. It is terribly embarrassing for her, but at least she is useful for running errands and cleaning up the messes at this party. Let us give her a hand for being such a good little helper. A few people in the crowd offered polite, highly uncomfortable claps. Someone near the front table winced and looked away. But my mother threw her head back and laughed. It was a loud, piercing, genuine laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. My father chuckled along, raising his glass toward Chloe as if she had just delivered a brilliant and witty toast. Trent smirked and adjusted his heavy gold watch, shaking his head at me in mock sympathy. For over 20 years, this was the exact dynamic. Humiliate Sarah. Make Sarah the punchline of every joke. Keep Sarah small so Chloe could feel big. A year ago, I would have crumbled under the weight of their cruelty. I would have looked down at my cheap shoes, blinked back hot tears, and rushed into the kitchen to hide. I would have spent the rest of the night wondering what was fundamentally wrong with me, why I was so unlovable, and what I needed to do to finally earn their respect. But tonight, I did not cry. I did not look away. I stood perfectly still, holding my glass of water, and I looked right back at my mother. I watched her wipe a tear of mirth from her eye. I watched my father beam with pride at his cruel youngest daughter. I watched Trent whisper something in Chloe's ear that made her giggle. A strange, deep sense of absolute calm washed over me. It was the peaceful realization that the people who were supposed to love me were completely, hopelessly blind. They thought they held all the power in the room. They thought I was just the tragic spinster sister who would always be there to balance their checkbooks and endure their verbal abuse. They did not know what I had found in the company safe 6 months ago. They did not know about the secret bank accounts, the hidden shell companies, or the millions of dollars Trent had been actively stealing from our largest corporate partner. They had no idea that the luxury they were flaunting tonight was built on massive federal fraud. And they certainly did not know that the billionaire owner of that defrauded company was currently stepping out of a black town car outside this very restaurant. I did not flinch under the weight of their mocking stares. Instead, I slowly raised my left hand and checked my watch. It was exactly 8 o'clock, the exact time we had agreed upon. I set my water glass down on a passing waiter's silver tray. I smoothed the skirt of my cheap black dress. I reached under the collar of my fabric and closed my fingers around a heavy platinum chain hiding against my chest. I smiled, waiting for the heavy oak doors of the private dining room to swing open, ready for the real party to finally begin. I did not lower my eyes. I did not apologize for existing. I simply offered my sister a calm and empty smile, and then I looked down at my watch. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The string quartet was still playing, the champagne was still flowing, and my family was still completely oblivious to the trap that was about to snap shut around them. To understand how I could stand there, with absolute ice in my veins, while my own mother laughed at my public humiliation, you have to understand what happens when a lifetime of blind loyalty is finally shattered. For 35 years, I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I solved enough of their problems, they would eventually love me. I was the reliable one, the workhorse, the shield they used to protect themselves from the consequences of their own actions. I accepted that role because they were my family, and I thought family meant absolute trust. But that trust did not die tonight in this beautiful and heavily decorated restaurant. It died exactly 6 months ago on a freezing Tuesday night in November under the harsh and flickering fluorescent lights of the Bennett Freight Brokerage main office. It was 2 in the morning. The Chicago wind was howling against the frosted glass of the building, rattling the heavy window panes. The entire city was asleep, but I was sitting at my cramped metal desk, staring at a computer screen until my vision blurred. I had been at the office for 18 hours straight. As the company-licensed, certified public accountant, the burden of our quarterly tax filings fell entirely on my shoulders. My father, Richard, had been pacing around my desk earlier that afternoon, sweating through his expensive suit, begging me to finalize the reports. He told me the company was facing a temporary cash flow crisis. He said Trent, my brother-in-law, and our supposedly brilliant chief executive officer had made a few aggressive investments that were temporarily tying up our capital. My father had placed his heavy hand on my shoulder and used that desperate fatherly tone he knew I could never resist. He told me the family was depending on me to make the numbers balance. He needed me to sign the audit reports so the banks would not freeze our credit lines. I wanted to save my father. I wanted to save the legacy he claimed to have built. So I stayed. I brewed another pot of terrible break-room coffee, rubbed my burning eyes, and began digging into the master ledgers. But the deeper I went into the digital files, the less sense the numbers made. As a professional auditor, I am trained to look for anomalies. I read financial statements the way a mechanic listens to a car engine, and this engine was knocking terribly. According to the ledgers, we were hemorrhaging money, but it was not going to aggressive investments or standard operational costs. Massive and staggering amounts of capital were being funneled into a series of shell companies. I traced a series of recurring wire transfers, $50,000 here, $80,000 there. They were all categorized under vague administrative expenses and consulting fees. The payments were being authorized by Trent, but they were deliberately routed through the accounts that I personally managed. A cold and creeping sensation began to spread through my chest. I pulled up the vendor profiles for these consulting firms. There were no physical addresses, just post office boxes in offshore jurisdictions, and the funds were being systematically drained from the escrow accounts of our largest and most powerful corporate partner, Cole Logistics. Cole Logistics was an absolute behemoth in the transportation industry, run by a notoriously ruthless billionaire named Julian Cole. My father and Trent hated him. They spent hours in the boardroom complaining about his strict vendor policies and his relentless demand for perfection. Yet looking at the screen, I realized Trent was not just overcharging Julian Cole. He was blatantly stealing from him. The scale of the fraud was breathtaking. Millions of dollars had been siphoned out of the Cole Logistics accounts over the past 3 years. But the money was not just disappearing into thin air. I cross-referenced the dates of the offshore transfers with my sister's social media posts. The week Trent authorized a $90,000 consulting fee, Chloe posted a photo of the deed to her new luxury summer home. The day after a $50,000 transfer, Patricia, my mother, was driving a brand new Range Rover that she claimed was a surprise anniversary gift from my father. My family was not struggling with cash flow. They were living like royalty on stolen money. And then the final and most devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I looked at the signature lines on the compliance reports my father had begged me to rush through. Trent had deliberately structured the accounting software so that every single fraudulent transfer required the digital authorization of the chief compliance officer, me. My breath caught in my throat. The quiet hum of the office suddenly felt deafening. They were not just stealing, they were framing me. My parents and my brother-in-law knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that if Cole Logistics ever ordered a forensic audit, or if the federal authorities ever raided this office, the paper trail would completely bypass Trent and his office. It would lead directly to my desk. They were using my professional license, my clean record, and my desperate desire for their approval to build a perfect firewall. If the empire collapsed, they would keep the luxury cars and the summer homes, and I would be the one going to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. I was not their trusted daughter. I was their designated scapegoat. Panic surged through my veins, hot and sharp. My instinct was to run to leave the building to call the police. But my professional training kicked in. Digital files could be altered. Passwords could be changed remotely. If I confronted them now, without irrefutable physical proof, Trent would wipe the servers by sunrise. I would look like a disgruntled and hysterical employee trying to blame her family for her own mistakes. I needed the hard copies. I needed the original banking tokens and the unredacted vendor contracts. Trent was lazy, but he was also incredibly paranoid. He did not trust digital cloud storage for his most sensitive personal documents. He kept them in the old and heavy floor safe, hidden behind the mahogany bookshelf in his corner office. I stood up from my desk. My legs felt like lead, but my mind had never been clearer. I walked down the dark and carpeted hallway toward Trent and his executive suite. The building was completely silent. Every shadow felt like a threat. I slipped inside his office and closed the heavy oak door behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I did not dare turn on the overhead lights. I used the dim and blue glow of my cell phone flashlight to navigate past his massive leather chair and push the rolling bookshelf aside. There it was, the solid steel dial of the floor safe. Trent thought he was a mastermind, but he was careless with the people he considered beneath him. He had once made me retrieve his passport from this very safe before a golf trip to Cabo, barking the combination at me over speakerphone while I ran his errands. He never bothered to change the code. He assumed I was too dull and too obedient to ever look inside again. My hands shook violently as I knelt on the carpet. I wiped my sweaty palms on my slacks. I took a deep breath, placed my fingers on the cold metal dial, and began to turn. 32 right, 14 left, 57 right. A heavy and metallic clank echoed in the silent room. I pulled the heavy steel door open. The stale smell of old paper and dust drifted up into the air. I shined my phone light down into the dark cavity. There were bundles of cash, a few expensive watches, and a velvet jewelry box. But that was not what made my heart stop. Resting at the very bottom of the safe, hidden beneath a stack of blank corporate checks, was a thick stack of bright red files. I reached down and pulled the top folder into the light. I opened it, and the absolute truth of my family and their betrayal stared back at me in black and white. There were original incorporation documents for the offshore accounts, all bearing forged versions of my signature. There were printed emails between my father and Trent discussing exactly how long they could keep me in the dark before the federal auditors noticed the missing capital. My own father had responded to a message asking if I would figure it out with a single and dismissive line. He had written that I was too eager to please and too desperate for their affection to ever question the numbers. I sat on the floor of that dark office, clutching the red files to my chest as the first light of dawn began to creep through the Chicago skyline. I did not shed a single tear. The woman who had walked into this building yesterday, the desperate and pleading daughter who just wanted to belong, was dead. I carefully placed the red files into my briefcase, closed the heavy steel safe, and spun the dial to lock it. I was not going to federal prison for them. I was going to burn their entire stolen empire to the ground. 6 months before that anniversary dinner, I was sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Bennett Freight Brokerage main office. It was a freezing night in November, the kind of Chicago evening where the wind rattles the heavy glass windows. The rest of the city was asleep, but I was staring at a glowing computer monitor until my eyes burned. I had been at my desk for 14 hours straight. As the company's only licensed certified public accountant, the burden of our quarterly tax filings fell entirely on my shoulders. My father, Richard, had been pacing behind my desk just hours earlier. He was sweating through his expensive, tailored suit, rubbing the back of his neck, playing the role of the desperate patriarch perfectly. He told me the company was facing a severe cash flow crisis. He claimed Trent, my brother-in-law, and our supposedly brilliant chief operating officer had made a few aggressive investments that temporarily tied up our operational capital. My father placed his heavy hand on my shoulder. Using that soft pleading tone, he knew I could never resist. He told me the family was depending on me to make the numbers balance. He needed me to sign the official audit reports tonight, so the banks would not freeze our credit lines. I wanted to save my father. I wanted to protect the legacy he claimed to have built for us. So I stayed. I brewed another pot of bitter break-room coffee, rubbed my tired eyes, and began digging into the master ledgers. I told myself that families help each other, that my hard work would eventually be recognized. But the deeper I went into the digital files, the less sense the numbers made. As a professional auditor, I am trained to look for anomalies. I read financial statements the way a mechanic listens to a struggling engine, and this engine was knocking terribly. According to the ledgers, we were hemorrhaging money, but the funds were not going toward aggressive investments, equipment upgrades, or standard operational costs. Massive, staggering amounts of capital were being funneled into a series of unknown vendors. I traced a series of recurring wire transfers. $50,000 here. $80,000 there. They were all categorized under vague administrative expenses and consulting fees. The payments were being authorized by Trent, but they were deliberately routed through the specific compliance accounts that I personally managed. A cold, creeping sensation began to spread through my chest. I pulled up the vendor profiles for these consulting firms. There were no physical addresses, no phone numbers, just post office boxes in offshore jurisdictions. They were shell companies, and the funds were being systematically drained from the escrow accounts of our largest and most powerful corporate partner, Cole Logistics. Cole Logistics was an absolute behemoth in the transportation industry, run by a notoriously ruthless billionaire named Julian Cole. My father and Trent hated him. They spent hours in the boardroom complaining about his strict vendor policies and his relentless demand for perfection. Yet looking at the screen, I realized Trent was not just overcharging Julian Cole. He was blatantly stealing from him. The scale of the fraud was breathtaking. Millions of dollars had been siphoned out of the Cole Logistics accounts over the past 3 years. But the stolen money was not just disappearing into thin air. My mind raced back to the sudden influx of wealth my family had been flaunting. The week Trent authorized a $90,000 consulting fee was the exact same week my sister Chloe posted a photo of the deed to her new luxury summer home. The day after a $50,000 transfer, my mother was driving a brand new Range Rover that she claimed was a surprise anniversary gift from my father. My family was not struggling with a cash flow crisis. They were living like royalty on stolen money. And then the final and most devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I looked closely at the signature lines on the compliance reports my father had begged me to rush through. Trent had deliberately structured the accounting software so that every single fraudulent transfer required the digital authorization of the chief compliance officer. Me. My breath caught in my throat. The quiet hum of the office suddenly felt deafening. They were not just stealing. They were framing me. My parents and my brother-in-law knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that if Cole Logistics ever ordered a forensic audit, or if the federal authorities ever raided this office, the paper trail would completely bypass Trent. It would lead directly to my desk. They were using my professional license, my clean criminal record, and my desperate desire for their affection to build a perfect legal firewall. If the empire collapsed, they would keep the luxury cars and the summer homes, and I would be the one going to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. I was not their trusted daughter. I was their designated scapegoat. Panic surged through my veins, hot and sharp. My instinct was to run to leave the building to call the police immediately. But my professional training kicked in. Digital files could be altered, passwords could be changed remotely. If I confronted them now without irrefutable physical proof, Trent would wipe the servers by sunrise. I would look like a disgruntled, hysterical employee trying to blame her own family for her terrible financial mistakes. I needed the hard copies. I needed the original banking tokens, the unredacted vendor contracts, and the direct proof of their conspiracy. Trent was lazy, but he was also incredibly paranoid. He did not trust digital cloud storage for his most sensitive personal documents. He kept them locked away in the heavy floor safe, hidden behind the mahogany bookshelf in his corner office. I stood up from my desk. My legs felt like lead, but my mind had never been clearer. I walked down the dark carpeted hallway toward Trent's executive suite. The building was completely silent. Every shadow felt like a threat. I slipped inside his office and closed the heavy oak door behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I did not dare turn on the overhead lights. I used the dim blue glow of my cell phone flashlight to navigate past his massive leather chair and push the rolling bookshelf aside. There it was, the solid steel dial of the floor safe. Trent thought he was a mastermind, but he was careless with the people he considered beneath him. He had once made me retrieve his passport from this very safe before a golf trip, barking the combination at me over speakerphone while I ran his personal errands. He never bothered to change the code. He assumed I was too dull and too blindly obedient to ever look inside again. My hands shook violently as I knelt on the carpet. I wiped my sweaty palms on my slacks. I took a deep breath, placed my fingers on the cold metal dial, and began to turn. The heavy steel door of the floor safe swung open with a quiet click that felt deafening in the silent office. I knelt on the carpet and reached inside, pulling out a thick leather binder. It was Trent's private ledger, the real one. As I flipped through the stiff parchment pages, my eyes darting across the columns of ink, a chilling reality began to take shape. I was looking at a masterpiece of corporate theft. The numbers were staggering. $3 million had been siphoned from Cole Logistics over the past 2 years. $3 million. It was not a cash flow crisis. It was a calculated, systematic bleeding of our biggest partner. Every single transfer had been perfectly disguised as a legitimate freight consulting fee, and every single one had been routed through the compliance accounts that bore my digital signature. My mind instantly flashed to my younger sister and the extravagant life she paraded in front of everyone. Just last month, Chloe had closed on a sprawling 6-bedroom mansion in a gated community. She claimed Trent had received a massive executive bonus for his brilliant leadership. 2 weeks after that, my mother, Patricia, drove up to our Sunday dinner in a brand new, pristine white Range Rover. She had proudly announced it was a spontaneous gift from my father to celebrate their upcoming anniversary. I had spent my entire weekend helping them clean the garage to make room for it while driving my own battered 8-year-old car, now staring at the dates of the offshore wire transfers in the ledger. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The mansion, the luxury SUV, the designer dresses they wore to humiliate me. None of it was earned. It was all paid for with stolen money. But the financial theft was not the worst thing hiding in that safe. Tucked beneath the heavy ledger was a small black digital flash drive labeled with a piece of white masking tape. It simply read, "Security Backup." Trent had always been paranoid about the cleaning staff and had installed a hidden audio and video camera in his office a year ago. I knew about the camera, but I had never seen the footage. My hands trembled as I took the drive and plugged it directly into my laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying dozens of encrypted video files. I clicked on the most recent one, dated just 3 days ago. The harsh glow of the computer screen illuminated my face in the dark office as the video began to play. On the screen, my father Richard was pouring a glass of bourbon from the crystal decanter on Trent's desk. My mother Patricia was sitting in the leather guest chair, crossing her legs elegantly. Trent was leaning against the mahogany desk. They were discussing the upcoming federal audit. I turned up the volume, leaning closer to the speakers. "Are you absolutely sure the firewall holds?" my father asked, his voice thick with anxiety. "What if the FBI decides to look deeper into the coal logistics accounts?" Trent laughed, an arrogant and dismissive sound. "Richard Fye designed it perfectly. The consulting firm is completely untraceable, and if the federal investigators do come knocking, they will follow the digital authorization trail. It goes straight to the chief accountant." My mother took a sip of her drink and sighed. "Poor Sarah. She is so desperate to please us, she signs whatever you put in front of her. But Trent, if she goes to prison, the scandal could ruin our social standing." My father waved his hand, cutting her off. "Better Sarah takes the fall than Trent. We need him to keep the business running. Sarah is a smart girl. She will survive a few years in a minimum security facility." I stopped the video. The silence in the office rushed back in, pressing against my eardrums. I could not breathe. My chest tightened so painfully, I thought my heart might actually stop beating. For 35 years, I had believed my family was simply thoughtless. I thought they favored my sister because she was charming, and I was just the quiet, reliable workhorse. I had spent my entire adulthood bending over backwards, sacrificing my savings, my youth, and my self-esteem just to earn a fraction of their love. But they did not love me at all. They viewed me as a disposable asset, a convenient shield, a sacrificial lamb to slaughter on the altar of their greed. They were fully prepared to let me sit in a federal prison cell wearing a jumpsuit so they could continue to drive their luxury cars and drink expensive bourbon. A hot, blinding wave of fury washed over me, burning away every ounce of loyalty I had ever felt for the Bennett family. I reached for my phone, ready to dial the police and hand over everything, but as my thumb hovered over the screen, my professional training kicked in, forcing me to stop. I looked back at the ledger. The paper trail proved the money was gone, and the video proved they knew about it. But I was missing the final puzzle piece. The actual offshore wire transfer authorizations bearing Trent's encrypted digital footprint. Without those documents, a good lawyer could argue the video was taken out of context, and that I, as the accountant, was the true mastermind trying to frame my innocent family. If I went to the authorities now, I would still be the prime suspect. I needed the final wire proofs, and Trent did not keep them here. The only place those specific routing numbers existed was on the receiving end in the highly secure vendor database of Coal Logistics itself. I slowly unplugged the flash drive and slipped it into my pocket. I could not go to the police. I had to go straight into the lion's den. I had to somehow secure a face-to-face meeting with Julian Cole himself. Getting into the global headquarters of Cole Logistics was not something an ordinary person could just do on a whim. The massive glass and steel tower dominated the Chicago skyline, guarded by layers of biometric security, private elevator banks, and highly paid receptionists who looked more like runway models than administrative staff. But I was not an ordinary person making a casual visit. I was a desperate certified public accountant who had spent the last 10 years mapping out the complex digital architecture of corporate financial systems. I knew exactly how to find the blind spots. Using my administrative access to our freight brokerage network, I created a sophisticated ghost profile. I drafted a highly urgent vendor compliance audit request and routed it through a disguised email server, flagging it with the exact priority codes I knew Cole Logistics required for immediate executive attention. I booked a 10 in the morning appointment under a vague corporate alias. It was a massive federal crime, but compared to the $3 million my family was actively stealing, scheduling a fake meeting felt like a minor and necessary offense. The next morning, I walked through the heavy revolving doors of the Cole Logistics building. My heart was hammering against my ribs so violently, I thought the armed security guards would be able to hear it echoing in the marble lobby. I was wearing my best thrift store blazer and carrying a cheap scuffed leather briefcase that contained the encrypted flash drive from Trent's safe. When I gave the polished receptionist my alias, she barely glanced at my faded clothes before handing over a digital visitor badge and directing me to the executive elevators. The 70th floor was dead silent, covered in thick slate gray carpet and lined with modern art that probably cost more than I would make in a lifetime. A senior executive assistant led me down a long hallway toward a set of massive frosted glass doors. She pushed them open, announced my fake compliance firm, and stepped aside. I walked into the room and the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside. Sitting behind a sprawling desk of solid black marble was Julian Cole. He was 38 years old, a self-made billionaire who had built a global logistics empire from absolute scratch. He did not look like the old, stuffy executives my father usually dealt with. Julian wore a dark tailored suit without a tie, his dark hair slightly messy, his jawline sharp and set with natural, intimidating authority. He was typing rapidly on a silver laptop, projecting an intense aura of someone whose time was literally worth thousands of dollars a minute. He did not look up immediately. He just gestured blindly toward the empty leather guest chair opposite his desk. I did not sit down. I stood perfectly still in the center of the vast office, clutching my briefcase, trying to force oxygen into my panicked lungs. When he finally raised his head, his sharp blue eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, there was no recognition, only polite impatience. But Julian Cole was a man who survived by noticing everything. His gaze dropped to the visitor badge clipped to my lapel, then back up to my face. The polite impatience vanished, replaced instantly by a freezing, calculated hostility. "You are not a senior compliance auditor from the restructuring firm," he said. His voice was deep, incredibly calm, and utterly terrifying. "No, I am not," I answered. My voice shook, but I forced myself to hold his intense stare. "My name is Sarah Bennett. I am the chief accountant for Bennett Freight Brokerage." The moment the word Bennett left my mouth, the temperature in the room plummeted. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, staring at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "I know exactly who you are," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You are Richard Bennett's daughter, the sister-in-law of that arrogant fool Trent, which means you have exactly 10 seconds to explain how you bypassed my building security before I have you arrested for corporate trespassing." He reached toward the sleek black telephone on his desk. His finger hovered over the emergency security button. "Mr. Cole, please." I stepped forward, raising a hand. "I need you to listen to me." "I do not need to listen to anyone from your deceitful family," Julian interrupted, his voice raising just a fraction sharp as a razor. "For the past 2 years, your father and your brother-in-law have done nothing but publicly criticize my company. They complain to the trade press about my strict vendor policies. They whine constantly about our shipping rates. They have called my management style draconian in open board meetings. And now, the Bennett family accountant sneaks into my private office under a fabricated name." He pressed a button on his phone. Security, we have a breach on the executive floor. I need guards to my office immediately. He released the button and looked at me with cold, hard satisfaction. They will be here in less than 2 minutes. I suggest you wait quietly. Panic surged through my veins, hot and blinding. If security dragged me out of here, the police would be called. Trent would be notified immediately. He would wipe the servers, destroy the hidden ledger, and empty the offshore accounts before I even made it to the police station for questioning. I would lose my only chance to prove my innocence, and my family would watch me go to federal prison without shedding a single tear. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. The desperate daughter who had always made herself small was completely gone. I marched directly up to his black marble desk. I unlatched my cheap briefcase, pulled out the encrypted flash drive, and slammed it down on the smooth stone surface. The loud, sharp crack echoed through the massive office. Julian flinched slightly, his eyes narrowing in surprise at my sudden aggression. "Go ahead and throw me out, Mr. Cole," I said, my voice rising, fueled by a decade of repressed anger. "Throw me out and let your guards drag me down to the lobby. But while you sit up here in your beautiful glass tower, feeling smug and untouchable, you are bleeding capital. You are losing $500,000 every single month, and you do not even know it." Julian froze. His hand slowly moved away from the telephone. He looked at the flash drive on his desk, then back up at my face. The absolute certainty in my voice had caught his attention. A self-made billionaire does not ignore the mention of stolen money. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I said you are being robbed blind," I repeated, refusing to back down. "My family has been actively stealing from your escrow accounts for over 2 years. They are using untraceable shell companies and falsified consulting invoices. I have the digital footprints, the internal ledgers, and the video confessions. But I need the final wire transfer authorizations from your secure vendor database to prove it to the federal authorities." Heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. The security guards had arrived. The thick frosted glass doors rattled as someone grabbed the heavy brass handles. Julian Cole stared at me. He looked at my cheap suit, my shaking hands, and the desperate, furious fire burning in my eyes. "Mr. Cole, they are at the door." A muffled, urgent voice called from the hallway. "Do you want us to come in?" I held my breath. My entire life, my freedom and my future rested on what this man would do in the next 5 seconds. Julian did not look away from me. He reached over and pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Stand down," he ordered calmly. "The situation is handled. Ms. Bennett and I are going to have a very long conversation." The sharp crack of the plastic flash drive hitting the solid marble desk echoed through the massive office. Julian Cole froze. His hand, which had been reaching for the security intercom, stopped entirely. He looked down at the small black device, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. I was trembling on the inside, my stomach twisting into painful knots, but I forced my posture to remain perfectly straight. I did not blink. I did not look away. "You are losing $500,000 a month." I repeated, my voice steady and completely devoid of the panic that was screaming through my veins. "Kick me out, Mr. Cole. Let your guards drag me down to the lobby. But if you do, you will lose absolutely everything. Give me 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, and I will show you exactly who the thief is and how they are doing it." For a moment, the room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 70 floors below. Julian stared at me. The absolute hostility in his sharp blue eyes began to shift, replaced by something much more dangerous. It was raw, calculated curiosity. A man does not build a billion-dollar logistics empire by ignoring a direct threat to his capital. He withdrew his hand from the phone. He picked up the flash drive, turning it over in his fingers, evaluating the weight of my claim. Then, without saying a word, he plugged it into his silver laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated his face. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as he opened the encrypted folders I had prepared. I had organized the files meticulously, the way a master auditor builds an undeniable case. There were the falsified vendor invoices, the shell company registration documents, and the internal ledgers showing the exact dates and amounts siphoned from his escrow accounts. I had even included the video file of my father and brother-in-law discussing the theft. I stood in the center of the office, holding my breath. I watched the realization hit him. I watched the initial skepticism wash away, leaving behind a cold and terrifying fury. The muscles in his jaw tightened. His knuckles turned white against the edge of his keyboard. When Julian finally looked up from the screen, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. He was no longer looking at me like an annoying pest. I was looking at me like a vital asset in a war he had not known he was fighting. "They are using my own compliance protocols against me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Your brother-in-law set up ghost vendors using offshore registries, and your father is pushing the approvals through the blind spots in our automated billing system." I nodded, taking a small step forward. "Yes, they have been doing it for 2 years. They structured the fraud perfectly to bypass your executive oversight." Julian stood up. He paced toward the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. His anger was palpable, a physical force that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He turned back to me, his eyes blazing with a fierce, uncompromising resolve. "I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he announced, walking briskly back toward his desk. "I am going to have federal agents raid your family office before noon. I will have your father and your brother-in-law in handcuffs by dinner time, and I will freeze every single asset attached to the Bennett name." He reached for his phone. "No." I lunged forward and slammed my hand down on top of his phone, physically stopping him from lifting the receiver. Julian stared at my hand, then up at my face, utterly shocked by my audacity. No one touches a billionaire in his own office. But I was fighting for my life, and I had no room left for polite boundaries. "You cannot call the FBI," I told him, my voice urgent and pleading. "If you call the authorities right now, they will send a standard inquiry notice to our legal department. Trent has a network of high-priced defense attorneys who specialize in asset protection. The moment they get wind of an investigation, they will execute a contingency plan. They will move the stolen money into untraceable cryptocurrency accounts within 24 hours. They will wipe the internal servers, burn the physical ledgers, and destroy the shell company records." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to hold his intense gaze. And then I continued, my voice dropping to a painful whisper. "They will hand the FBI the compliance reports, bearing my digital signature. They will frame me as the sole mastermind. They will keep your money, and I will go to federal prison for the rest of my life." Julian slowly pulled his hand away from the phone. He looked at me, really looked at me, registering the desperate reality of my situation. He saw the cheap thrift store blazer I was wearing. He saw the dark circles of exhaustion under my eyes. He realized that the woman standing in front of him was not a criminal mastermind, but a sacrificial lamb trying to escape the slaughter. "So, what is your proposal, Sarah?" he asked quietly. The way he said my name sent a strange, unexpected shiver down my spine. I stepped back, reclaiming my professional composure. "I need the final proof," I explained. "The flash drive shows the internal theft, but it does not contain the final offshore wire transfer authorizations. Trent keeps the master SWIFT codes locked behind a biometric security wall in his personal accounts. Without those specific routing numbers, a good lawyer can argue the money was lost in bad investments, not stolen. We need the SWIFT codes to make the federal case completely bulletproof." I stood incredibly straight, offering him the most dangerous contract of my life. "Let me be your inside man," I proposed. "I have unrestricted physical access to the building. I know their schedules. I know their blind spots. I will go back into that office and I will get those SWIFT codes. I will gather enough irrefutable evidence to ensure your money is recovered, and my family goes to prison with no chance of parole." Julian narrowed his eyes, studying me with a mixture of suspicion and deep admiration. "And what do you want in return?" "Protection," I answered immediately. "When the FBI finally raids that building, I want your corporate attorneys to guarantee full immunity for me. I want my name completely cleared of this mess. I want my freedom." The massive office was silent again. The tension between us was electric, a dangerous and unspoken understanding forming in the heavy air. Julian Cole walked around his marble desk and stopped mere inches in front of me. He was tall, imposing, and radiating absolute power. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Sarah Bennett." He set his voice a smooth, dark rumble. "If your brother-in-law catches you snooping in his accounts, he will not just fire you. Men who steal millions of dollars, do terrible things to people who threaten their freedom. I looked up into his striking blue eyes. I have survived my family for 35 years, Mr. Cole. I am not afraid of them anymore. Julian stared at me for a long time. Then, very slowly, a sharp and brilliant smile spread across his face. "Call me Julian," he said, extending his hand. "We have a deal." I reached out and shook his hand. His grip was warm and remarkably strong, but as our hands connected, sealing this secret alliance, I knew the hardest part was just beginning, because going back into the lion's den was dangerous enough, but I had absolutely no idea how complicated things were about to get, now that I had tied my fate to a billionaire who was suddenly looking at me like I was the most fascinating woman he had ever met. The moment Julian Cole shook my hand, his entire demeanor shifted from a cornered executive to a military general preparing for a siege. He knew that my brother-in-law Trent had eyes everywhere. The Bennett Freight Brokerage had deep ties with private investigators and shady corporate fixers. We could not risk meeting at a public library or a coffee shop. We certainly could not work out of his corporate headquarters, where the visitor logs were constantly monitored. Julian took me to a place that did not exist on any public record. It was a private residence in the Gold Coast neighborhood, registered under a blind offshore trust. From the outside, it looked like a restored historic brownstone. Inside it was a fortress of quiet luxury and absolute security. There were no cameras in the hallways, no doormen to remember my face, and no digital footprints connecting the property to Julian Cole. This became our secret war room. For the next month, my life became a punishing double shift. By day, I played the role of the obedient accountant at the family business. I endured my mother demanding I pick up her dry cleaning. I listened to my father praise Trent for his brilliant leadership, while I signed the very compliance reports they were using to frame me. I kept my head down, wore my faded sensible sweaters, and swallowed every insult. But the second the clock struck 7, and I was finally dismissed from my miserable desk, my real work began. I would drive my battered car to a grocery store parking lot 3 miles away, leave it under a broken street lamp, and walk the rest of the distance to the brownstone. Julian was always waiting. He had set up a massive oak dining table with 4 high-resolution monitors, encrypted servers, and stacks of legal pads. At first, our dynamic was strictly transactional. I was the desperate whistleblower trying to stay out of federal prison, and he was the ruthless chief executive trying to plug a $3 million hole in his logistics empire. But as the long nights stretched into the early hours of the morning, that dynamic began to fundamentally change. Julian sat across from me night after night, watching me dismantle Trent's complex financial labyrinth. Trent had used a sophisticated web of offshore shell companies, nested bank accounts, and fake vendor invoices to hide the stolen capital. A normal forensic audit team would have taken 6 months to untangle the mess, but I did not have 6 months. I had spent 10 years navigating the darkest corners of my family business. I knew how Trent thought. I knew his lazy habits, his preferred passwords, and his arrogant mistakes. I worked with a fierce and relentless focus, mapping out the exact digital routes the money took before landing in my sister's luxury real estate portfolio. Julian rarely spoke while I worked. He would sit in the shadows reviewing the corporate files I decrypted, watching my hands fly across the keyboard. Later, he told me that those quiet hours completely destroyed every preconceived notion he had about the Bennett family. He had spent years dealing with my father and Trent, knowing them as loud, arrogant men who covered their incompetence with expensive, tailored suits. Then he looked at me. I was sitting in his multi-million-dollar brownstone, wearing a $30 clearance rack dress and scuffed flat shoes. I had dark circles under my eyes from chronic sleep deprivation. My hair was tied up with a cheap plastic clip. I had none of the polish or the swagger of my family. Yet I was single-handedly dismantling a massive fraud scheme with nothing but a laptop and a profound understanding of tax law. The shift in Julian's perception happened gradually. It started with small gestures of respect. When I was too focused to remember to eat, he would silently place a plate of warm food next to my keyboard. When I fell asleep at the table, out of sheer exhaustion at 3 in the morning, he did not wake me up. He covered my shoulders with a heavy wool blanket and let me rest. One particular night stands out. It was pouring rain outside. I had just spent 4 hours breaking through a hidden firewall Trent had installed on a secondary server. When the encryption finally cracked, revealing a master ledger of illegal kickbacks, I let out a sharp breath and leaned back in my chair. I rubbed my burning eyes, feeling the familiar sting of tears. Not tears of sadness, but the overwhelming weight of realizing just how deeply my family hated me to set this trap so perfectly. Julian walked over and placed a mug of hot black coffee on the desk. He did not go back to his chair. He leaned against the edge of the heavy oak table, looking down at me. The harsh light of the monitors illuminated the sharp angles of his face. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice a low and steady rumble, "I employ a floor of the most expensive corporate lawyers and financial analysts in the country. They went to elite universities and wear custom suits. Not a single one of them caught this fraud. Not one of them has half the intelligence or the sheer grit that you possess." I looked up at him, my hands resting on the keyboard. "I am just trying to survive, Julian. I am just trying to make sure I do not pay for their crimes." "You are doing a lot more than surviving," he answered softly. He reached out and gently pushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was warm and completely unexpected, sending a sudden jolt of electricity straight to my chest. "You are brilliant. You have been carrying the weight of incompetent people your entire life. They convinced you that you were small, so they could feel big." I stared into his deep blue eyes, completely paralyzed. Nobody in my entire life had ever spoken to me that way. Nobody had ever looked past my quiet obedience to see the actual person underneath. My family saw me as a convenient tool. The business partners saw me as a lowly secretary. But Julian Cole, the billionaire CEO who terrified grown men in boardrooms, was looking at me like I was a revelation. He saw the cheap clothes, the exhaustion, and the fear, but he also saw the unyielding self-respect that had finally pushed me to fight back. In that quiet, rain-swept room, the transactional nature of our secret alliance dissolved entirely. He realized that the unassuming woman in the simple office attire was not just a means to an end. She was the most exceptional person he had ever met. The shift from a professional alliance to something much deeper did not happen overnight. It was not a sudden burst of reckless passion. For someone like me, who had spent 35 years being told I was fundamentally unlovable, trust was a very slow and difficult process. But Julian Cole was a man who understood the value of patience. During those long hours in his secret brownstone, we were building a case against my toxic family, but we were also unknowingly building a bridge to each other. I started noticing the small things. Julian remembered that I drank my coffee black when I was stressed, but preferred tea when I was reviewing endless pages of bank statements. He noticed when my shoulders grew tense, and without saying a single word, he would step behind my chair and gently massage the heavy knots out of my neck. In my entire life, no one had ever paid attention to my needs. My parents and my sister only paid attention to what I could provide for them. Julian paid attention to me. He listened to my opinions, respected my intellect, and treated my financial insights as absolute gold. The defining moment happened on a quiet Tuesday night. We had been reviewing a particularly complex web of offshore accounts that my brother-in-law had set up in the Cayman Islands. I had just cracked the routing sequence that proved my mother was directly receiving funds from the stolen escrow accounts to pay for her luxury vehicles. Seeing my own mother's name on those fraudulent deposits broke something fragile inside me. It was the final and undeniable proof that she knew exactly what they were doing. She was actively spending the money that would eventually send me to a federal prison. I pushed my chair back from the heavy oak table and stood up. My chest was heaving. The sheer cruelty of it all finally crashed over me like a suffocating wave. I walked over to the large window, wrapping my arms around myself, trying desperately to hold my composure together. I did not want to cry in front of a billionaire. I did not want to look weak or dramatic. I felt his presence before he even spoke. Julian stepped up behind me. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me it was going to be fine. He simply placed his hands on my shoulders and turned me around to face him. When I looked up into his deep blue eyes, the walls I had built around my heart completely crumbled. I let out a choked sob, and Julian pulled me into his arms. He held me with a fierce and protective strength that I had never experienced. I buried my face in his chest, letting decades of rejection, betrayal, and exhaustion pour out of me in a silent flood of tears. "You are going to survive them, Sarah." He whispered, his voice a low and steady rumble against my ear. "I swear to you, they will never hurt you again." I looked up at him, my face streaked with tears. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy, charged with a magnetic tension that had been quietly building for weeks. Julian reached up and gently wiped a tear from my cheek with his thumb. His gaze dropped to my lips, and then very slowly he leaned in. The kiss was an absolute revelation. It was not hurried or desperate. It was deliberate, tender, and incredibly profound. It felt like an anchor dropping into a stormy sea, grounding me in a reality where I was finally valued. When he kissed me, I felt 35 years of invisibility wash away. I kissed him back with everything I had, pouring all my stored-up hope into that single and defining moment. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. Julian rested his forehead against mine. We were officially in love. It was a terrifying and beautiful realization. But almost immediately, I felt his body tense. The warmth of the moment was suddenly pierced by the freezing reality of our situation. Julian stepped back, his expression shifting from tender devotion to absolute dread. He ran a hand through his dark hair, pacing away from the window. "We cannot do this," he said, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. "Not yet." I felt a cold spike of panic and asked him what he meant. He turned back to me, his eyes full of fear, a completely foreign look for a man like Julian Cole. He explained that if we admit what this is, we become a massive liability to each other. Trent was paranoid. My father was desperate. Julian warned me that if they even suspect we have a personal connection, if they catch wind that I am involved with the CEO of the company, they are robbing Trent, will instantly execute his contingency plan. Julian closed the distance between us and took both of my hands in his. "Sarah, if they know we are together, Trent will destroy the Swift codes. He will wipe the servers and burn the physical ledgers. And then he will hand the federal authorities the compliance reports bearing your digital signatures. I could lose my money, and I do not care about that. But you will go to federal prison. I cannot protect you if we lose the element of surprise." I understood completely. The stakes were a matter of life and death for my freedom. We have to remain absolute strangers in the daylight. I told him, my voice trembling but resolute. "No one can know. We have to keep this a total secret until the trap is sprung." Julian nodded, lifting my hands and kissing my knuckles. He promised me that the moment the FBI put them in handcuffs, I would be his. But until then, I had to play the role of the obedient, pathetic daughter perfectly. I could not slip up. I could not give them a single reason to doubt my loyalty. I promised him I would be careful. I promised him I could handle the double life. But I had vastly underestimated how quickly my family could escalate their cruelty. The very next afternoon, I was sitting at my cramped desk at the family brokerage, trying to focus on a legitimate tax return. My cell phone vibrated violently against the cheap metal desk. It was my mother. I answered, keeping my tone perfectly subservient. "Sarah, you need to come to the house immediately," my mother demanded. Her voice was sharp, laced with a frantic energy I rarely heard. I told her I was in the middle of the quarterly payroll and asked if it could wait until the evening. "No, it cannot wait." She snapped her tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Your father and Trent are already here. Chloe just arrived. We are having an emergency family meeting. Get your car and get over here right now." The line went dead. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. An emergency family meeting involving Trent meant something had gone terribly wrong. Had he noticed a digital footprint on his hidden servers? Had someone seen me leaving Julian's brownstone? I grabbed my purse, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I looked at my phone, desperate to call Julian, desperate to ask him what to do, but I was still inside the office. Trent's loyal secretaries were sitting right outside my door. I could not risk a phone call, and a text message could be intercepted on the company network. I was completely cut off, walking blindly into a trap, with absolutely no time to warn the man I loved. The summons came on a Sunday evening. I was sitting in my small 2-bedroom condominium folding laundry and enjoying a rare moment of absolute silence. This apartment was my sanctuary. I had saved for 7 years to afford the down payment, working 60-hour weeks and skipping every vacation, every luxury, just to have a place that was entirely mine. Then my phone vibrated violently against the coffee table. It was my mother, Patricia. Her voice was sharp, frantic, and completely devoid of warmth. She demanded I come to their house immediately. It was a family emergency, she claimed, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. I drove across town through the freezing rain, my tires splashing through deep puddles as I approached the sprawling suburban estate they called home. A massive house paid for by decades of theft and deception. When I walked through the heavy, custom-built oak front doors, the atmosphere inside was suffocating. My father, Richard, was pacing relentlessly in front of the massive stone fireplace. He was rubbing his chest, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. Patricia sat on the velvet sofa, clutching a lace handkerchief, the strong scent of her expensive perfume filling the room. My sister Chloe was slumped in a tufted leather armchair, scrolling on her phone with a profoundly bored expression. Her husband Trent, the actual architect of our supposed financial doom, was conveniently absent. "Sit down," Sarah, my father, ordered. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing or thank me for driving across the city in a storm. I took a seat on the very edge of a stiff wingback chair, keeping my posture rigid. "What is going on?" Patricia let out a loud theatrical sob, pressing the handkerchief to her mouth. "We are losing everything, Sarah. The company is completely underwater. We are facing an absolute catastrophe and we do not know what to do." I kept my face perfectly blank, locking my emotions behind a thick mental wall. I knew exactly why the company was bleeding money. I had seen the offshore wire transfers. I had seen the hidden ledgers in the dead of night, but I had to play my part flawlessly. "How is that possible?" I asked, injecting just the right amount of panic and confusion into my voice. Richard stopped pacing and glared at me. Trent made a severe miscalculation. He said, his voice tight with manufactured stress. "A temporary liquidity crisis. We need a massive infusion of cash by Friday afternoon, or the commercial banks will call in our loans. If that happens, the business goes bankrupt. We lose this house. We lose our entire legacy. And how much cash do you exactly need?" I asked, dreading the answer. $150,000, Chloe chimed in, not even bothering to look up from her glowing screen. She said the number as casually as if she were ordering a cup of coffee. The sheer audacity of that demand hung heavily in the quiet room. I looked at my younger sister, draped in silk and designer jewelry funded entirely by stolen capital. I looked at my parents, who had built their luxurious, picture-perfect life on my silent, unrewarded labor. For years, I had quietly managed their crises, paid their overlooked bills, and sacrificed my own financial stability so they could thrive without consequence. They had taught me early on that my worth was solely tied to my usefulness to them. "I do not have $150,000 in cash," I stated calmly, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "You know exactly what my salary is. You sign my paychecks." Patricia dabbed at her dry eyes, her tone shifting from sorrow to sharp calculation. "We know you do not have the liquid cash, Sarah, but you have your apartment. You have built up equity. We need you to take out a second mortgage immediately." My heart slammed against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. My apartment. The one safe space I had fought tooth and nail to secure. It was modest, slightly drafty, and far from glamorous, but it was mine. It was the only thing in this world that they did not control. Now they wanted to rip that away from me too. "You want me to mortgage my home?" I asked, letting my voice tremble, leaning into the role of the terrified daughter. Chloe sighed loudly, finally putting her phone down and rolling her eyes. "Oh, do not be so incredibly dramatic, Sarah. It is just a temporary loan. The company will pay you back with interest once Trent resolves the cash flow issue. You are single. You have no children. You have zero real responsibilities. The very least you can do is help the family when we are in a bind." The cruel dismissal in her voice was a highly familiar weapon. Growing up, I learned quickly that love in our household came with a strict ranking system, and my sister was always at the absolute top. Her needs were treated as national emergencies, while my needs were consistently considered burdensome and annoying. "I cannot do that," I said, firmly gripping the armrests of my chair. "If the company fails, I will lose my home. I will be completely homeless." That was the precise moment Patricia unleashed her ultimate, most devastating weapon. She dropped her lace handkerchief into her lap and looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. She began to cry, but these were not gentle, sorrowful tears. They were loud, heaving, manipulative sobs designed to crush my spirit. "How can you be so incredibly selfish?" Patricia wailed, pressing her hand against her chest as if I had physically struck her. "We raised you. We fed you. We gave you absolutely everything. And now, when your family is on the brink of total ruin, you refuse to lift a single finger to save us." "Mom, please," I started, but my father immediately cut me off, stepping toward me with an intimidating posture. "Look at me," Sarah Richard commanded, his voice shaking with intense, manufactured rage. His face was dangerously purple, the veins in his neck bulging. "Do you want to kill me? Is that what you truly want? Because my blood pressure is through the roof. The stress of this crushing debt is going to give me a massive stroke right here in this room. If you walk out that front door and refuse to sign those bank papers, my death will be entirely on your hands." The psychological manipulation was suffocating a heavy blanket of guilt, meant to smother my logic. They were actively weaponizing my father's health to force me into absolute financial ruin. If I had been the woman I was just 6 months ago, I would have completely broken down. I would have sobbed, apologized profusely for my terrible selfishness, and driven straight to the bank at dawn to sign my life away. I would have believed that their survival was my ultimate responsibility, because I had spent my entire life desperately trying to earn their elusive, conditional love. But I was not that broken woman anymore. I knew the absolute ugly truth. There was no temporary liquidity crisis. There was no innocent corporate miscalculation. I had cracked Trent's encrypted secondary ledgers late the night before. I knew exactly where that $150,000 was going. Trent had developed a massive, escalating gambling addiction. He had accrued a catastrophic debt with a private, ruthless offshore sports betting syndicate. The dangerous men he owed money to did not care about corporate audits or delayed shipping invoices. They wanted their cash immediately, and Trent was terrified for his safety. My parents were completely willing to let me lose my home, destroy my immaculate credit score, and risk total bankruptcy just to cover the gambling debts of a thief. They would gladly throw me to the wolves without a second thought to protect their golden child and her fraudulent husband. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me, crystallizing my next move. I needed more evidence. I needed the final irrefutable proof of their offshore accounts to hand over to Julian Cole and the federal authorities. If I flatly refused them right now, they would panic. They might scramble alert Trent and destroy the digital trails I had worked so desperately to uncover. I had to play along. I had to lean heavily into the role of the weak, desperate, accommodating daughter one last time. I lowered my head, staring at the expensive Persian rug beneath my scuffed shoes. I took a deep, ragged breath, forcing a single believable tear to roll slowly down my cheek. "Okay," I whispered, my voice sounding completely defeated and hollow. "Okay, I will do it. I will talk to the bank manager tomorrow morning and start the mortgage paperwork." Patricia stopped crying instantly. The transformation was almost terrifying to witness. Her face smoothed out completely, the frantic panic vanishing in a fraction of a second. She offered me a tight, victorious smile, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "I knew we could count on you, Sarah," she said, silk blouse. "Family always protects family." Richard let out a long, heavy sigh of relief, his manufactured anger evaporating as he sank comfortably into his leather armchair. He did not say thank you. Chloe simply picked up her phone and went back to scrolling, instantly bored now that she had gotten exactly what she wanted. I stood up, wrapping my cheap cardigan tightly around my shoulders, playing the part of the broken scapegoat until the very end. I promised to initiate the loan paperwork the following day. I walked out of that massive fraudulent estate and got into my old reliable car. As I pulled out of their long driveway into the freezing rain, my hands were no longer shaking with fear or sorrow. They were perfectly steady, with absolute unwavering resolve. They thought they had just secured their salvation by exploiting my lifelong loyalty. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the key to their complete and utter destruction. The morning after my parents demanded I sacrifice my only home, I drove to the Bennett Freight Brokerage office before the sun was even up. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. For 35 years, I had played the role of the obedient daughter perfectly. I knew exactly how to make my face look defeated. I knew exactly how to lower my voice so I sounded completely broken. When I walked into the main office at 8 o'clock, my mother and my father were already there, hovering around the reception desk with anxious energy. Trent strolled in 20 minutes late, holding a large iced coffee and looking incredibly smug. He wore a custom-tailored suit, paid for by the money he was actively stealing. He did not look like a man in the middle of a massive corporate cash flow crisis. He looked like a man who had just successfully bullied his sister-in-law into handing over her entire life savings. I waited until Trent settled into his large corner office before I knocked on his heavy oak door. I held a stack of blank bank forms in my hands. I kept my shoulders slumped and my gaze directed at the floor. I told him I had spoken to my mortgage lender that morning. I explained that because the loan was intended to infuse cash directly into the family business, the bank required the corporate guarantor to authorize the final wire transfer linking the accounts. It was a complete lie, of course. A basic commercial banking fabrication I had invented in my kitchen at 3 in the morning. But Trent was not an accountant. He was a lazy, arrogant thief who relied entirely on my expertise to manage the actual mechanics of money. Trent leaned back in his leather executive chair and sighed heavily, acting as if I was interrupting a highly important day of work. He complained about the endless bureaucracy of commercial banks. He asked if he really needed to call the loan officer himself. I shook my head, playing the role of the helpful, desperate workhorse. I told him I could handle all the tedious paperwork and the phone calls. I just needed him to log into the Secure Master terminal and leave his physical bank security token on my desk so I could generate the dual authentication codes for the loan officer. The hardware token was a small black device that generated a temporary 6-digit code every 60 seconds. It was the master key to Trent's entire offshore financial network. He hated using it because it required him to actually pay attention to the screen. He tossed the small black device across his desk. It landed right in front of me. He told me to get it done quickly because he had a long lunch scheduled at his private golf club. He stood up, grabbed his expensive leather jacket, and walked right out of the building. He handed me the key to his own destruction because he honestly believed I was too stupid and too terrified to ever look inside. The second I heard his car engine start in the parking lot, the defeated daughter vanished. I locked his office door from the inside. I sat down in his expensive leather chair and woke up his computer monitor. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I did not log into the local commercial bank. I used the physical token to bypass the primary firewall on his hidden browser network. The screen flashed green, granting me absolute and unrestricted access to the master accounts. The numbers staring back at me were staggering. There were 3 distinct offshore accounts registered in the Cayman Islands under corporate entities that did not actually exist. The balances totaled nearly $4 million. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking so violently I had to brace my elbows against the solid mahogany desk to focus the camera lens. I took clear, high-resolution photographs of every single screen. I captured the routing numbers, the SWIFT codes, the account holder names, and the exact timestamps of the massive transfers he had stolen from Julian Cole. But photographs were not enough for a federal indictment. Julian and I needed the raw digital ledgers to hand over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I pulled a small, encrypted USB drive from my shoe. I'd hidden it there, just in case my mother decided to search my purse, a horrible habit she had maintained since I was a teenager. I plugged the drive into the side of Trent's computer tower. A small window popped up on the screen, calculating the transfer time for the massive offshore data files. 2 minutes remaining. The silence in the office was deafening. I could hear the second hand ticking on the expensive wall clock. I could hear my own pulse hammering violently in my ears. I kept my eyes locked on the green progress bar slowly inching across the computer screen. I thought about Julian. I thought about the heavy diamond ring hidden under my collar against my chest. I thought about the beautiful future waiting for me on the other side of this absolute nightmare. 1 minute remaining. I pulled up a blank spreadsheet on a second monitor, ready to quickly hide the transfer window if anyone knocked on the door. But my family did not believe in knocking when it came to me. They believed they owned my time and my space. 30 seconds remaining. The green bar was agonizingly slow. I heard the sharp click of the doorknob turning. I had locked the door, but I had completely forgotten that the senior executives had master keys. The heavy brass lock tumbled loudly. My heart stopped entirely. I reached for the USB drive, but the transfer was at 95%. If I pulled it out now, the files would corrupt, and the entire mission would be ruined. The heavy oak door swung open. I did not have time to switch the monitors. I did not have time to pull my hand away from the computer tower. The bright screen displaying the Cayman Islands bank transfers illuminated my terrified face. Standing in the doorway was my younger sister, Chloe. She was holding a shopping bag from a luxury boutique, wearing a brand new designer dress paid for by the very stolen money glowing on the screen behind me. Her perfectly manicured hand was still resting on the doorknob. Her eyes darted from my frozen posture down to the small USB drive plugged into her husband's computer, and finally up to the highly classified offshore bank accounts displayed in massive font on the primary monitor. The green progress bar finally hit 100% with a soft, cheerful chime that echoed through the dead silent room. The heavy oak door swung open just as the green progress bar hit 100% with a soft, cheerful chime that echoed through the dead silent room. My heart completely stopped. The blood drained from my face so fast I felt physically dizzy, my stomach dropping into a bottomless freefall. Standing in the doorway was my younger sister, Chloe. She was weighed down by 3 massive shopping bags from a luxury boutique on the Magnificent Mile, wearing a brand new designer silk dress, paid for by the very stolen money currently glowing on the screen behind me. Her perfectly manicured hand was still resting on the brass doorknob. Her sharp eyes darted from my frozen, terrified posture in her husband's oversized leather chair down to the small black USB drive plugged into the computer tower and finally began to travel upward toward the highly classified offshore bank accounts displayed in massive font on the primary monitor. I had exactly 1 second to save my own life. If Chloe registered the words Cayman Islands or saw the staggering multi-million-dollar balances on that screen, she would instantly scream for Trent. The trap would snap shut on my neck instead of theirs. The federal investigators would find my digital signatures, and I would spend the rest of my life in a concrete cell. I needed a distraction so powerful, so incredibly blinding, that it would completely hijack her attention and stop her from reading the monitor. Fortunately, I knew exactly what my sister valued above all else in this world: her own absolute superiority. I did not try to hide the screen. I did not dive for the USB drive to rip it out. Instead, I let out a loud, pathetic, and violently dramatic sob. I buried my face in my hands, slumping forward over the heavy mahogany desk, forcing my shoulders to shake uncontrollably. I squeezed my eyes shut, digging my fingernails into my palms until genuine tears of raw, terrifying adrenaline spilled down my flushed cheeks. Chloe froze. Her eyes snapped away from the computer monitor and locked entirely onto my shaking form. The sudden chaotic display of raw emotion completely short-circuited whatever suspicion was forming in her mind. "What on earth are you doing in here?" she demanded, her voice dripping with immediate disgust and confusion. I sniffled loudly, wiping my wet cheeks with the back of my hand, playing the role of the desperate, broken spinster sister to absolute perfection. I was just looking. I stammered, making my voice sound thick, breathy, and utterly pathetic. Looking at what she snapped, stepping fully into the office, and letting her heavy designer shopping bags hit the carpet with a soft thud. I stood up from Trent's chair, keeping my head bowed, making myself look as small and insignificant as humanly possible. I pointed a trembling finger at her shopping bags, carefully keeping my body positioned to block the brightest part of the screen, completely ignoring the glowing monitors behind me. I just wanted to see what it felt like. I cried, letting my voice crack with manufactured, desperate jealousy. I saw you pull up in the new luxury car. I saw the bags from the boutique. I just wanted to sit in his expensive chair for 1 minute and imagine what it would be like to actually have money, to have a husband who buys me beautiful things. I have absolutely nothing, Chloe. I am 35 years old. I drive a car with a broken heater and I buy my clothes on clearance. I just wanted to pretend I was you. It was the most humiliating, degrading monologue of my entire life. Every single word tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. I was actively weaponizing my own trauma, feeding her the exact pathetic narrative my family had used to torment me since childhood. But I knew the twisted psychology of a golden child. I knew that presenting myself as a jealous, weeping failure would be completely irresistible to her ego. I watched her posture change instantly. The suspicion completely vanished from her beautiful face, replaced by a radiant, deeply satisfied smirk. She took a step closer, her eyes raking over my faded beige cardigan, my scuffed, sensible flat shoes, and my tear-stained face. She looked at me like I was a diseased animal that had somehow wandered into her pristine palace. "Oh, Sarah," she sighed, crossing her arms over her expensive silk dress. Her voice was laced with a toxic, condescending pity that made my stomach physically turn. "This is just incredibly sad, even for you." I kept my head down, forcing another loud sob to escape my lips. "I know," I whimpered. "I am sorry. I will go back to my desk right now." "You really should," Chloe said, stepping closer to admire her own reflection in the dark glass of a framed diploma on the wall. "Sitting in Trent's chair is not going to magically fix your miserable life. You are 35 and completely alone because you have zero ambition and zero style. You let Dad walk all over you because you are too weak to demand anything better. Staring at my shopping bags is not going to change the fact that you are the ultimate family failure." I nodded frantically, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted a sharp tang of copper. "You are right," I whispered, playing the beaten, obedient dog until the very bitter end. "You are always right." Chloe picked up her luxury shopping bags, adjusting them on her arm with a haughty, elegant flick of her wrist. She tossed her perfect blonde hair over her shoulder and looked at me one last time with absolute, unfiltered contempt. "Clean up your face, Sarah. You look like a complete mess. And wipe down Trent's keyboard before you leave. He absolutely hates it when the administrative staff touches his personal things." She turned on her heel and walked out of the office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. She never even glanced at the computer monitor. The exact second the door latched, the pathetic weeping facade dropped from my face like a heavy theater curtain falling to the stage. My tears instantly stopped. My spine straightened into a rigid rod of absolute steel. I did not waste a single fraction of a second. I reached down, gripped the small black USB drive, and pulled it free from the computer tower. The Cayman Islands bank routing numbers, the master SWIFT codes, and the multi-million-dollar transaction logs were safely encrypted in the palm of my sweating hand. I quickly closed out the secure browser, cleared the access cache, and reset Trent's master token terminal so it looked exactly as he had left it that morning. I slipped the USB drive deep into the pocket of my cheap slacks, resting my hand over it to feel its solid, heavy reality against my leg. Chloe thought she had just put me in my place. She thought she had just asserted her absolute dominance over her sad, lonely older sister. She had walked out of this room feeling like an untouchable queen. But as I wiped down Trent's keyboard, just as she had commanded, a cold and terrifying smile spread across my face. She did not know that she had just handed me the final, irrefutable weapon I needed to destroy her entire fraudulent kingdom. I left the family office with the encrypted flash drive burning a hole in my coat pocket. The adrenaline that kept my hand steady when Chloe stood in the doorway vanished the moment I sat in my car. My body shook violently. I gripped the steering wheel and cried from profound exhaustion. I had just agreed to mortgage the only space I owned to protect a family actively plotting to send me to federal prison. I drove through the freezing Chicago rain to the secret Gold Coast brownstone. When I unlocked the heavy door and stepped into the foyer, I dropped my wet coat. I sank onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, buried my face in my hands, and let the crushing weight of the day overtake me. Julian found me there 10 minutes later. He had been on a conference call, but the moment he saw me sitting on the stairs, he dropped his phone and knelt in front of me. He pulled my trembling hands away from my face. I told him everything. I told him how my mother weaponized my father's health to force me into signing away my apartment equity. I told him how Trent carelessly tossed me his bank token and how Chloe humiliated me while millions of stolen dollars glowed on the screen behind her. As I spoke, the calculated calm of a billionaire chief executive evaporated. Julian's jaw tightened so fiercely I thought his teeth might shatter. His blue eyes darkened with raw and terrifying fury. He stood up and paced the hallway, running a hand through his dark hair. "They are using your own home to finance their theft," he said, his voice a dangerous rumble. "I am not waiting anymore, Sarah. I am calling the federal authorities tonight. I am going to freeze their accounts by morning and watch federal agents drag them out of their beds." I stood up and caught his arm. "No," I pleaded, my voice urgent. "We have the final routing numbers now. The trap is perfectly set. If we act too soon, they will claim I acted alone, and the offshore accounts will vanish. We have to wait for the anniversary dinner. We have to let them feel utterly secure." Julian stopped pacing. He looked down at me, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. He reached up and gently cupped my face, his thumb wiping away a stray tear. He hated seeing me suffer. He hated that I had to return to that toxic house and pretend to be small. He took a deep breath, forcing his anger down, locking it away until the time was right. Then, without saying a single word, he walked over to his heavy oak desk in the study and opened the bottom drawer. When he returned to the hallway, he did not just stand in front of me. Julian Cole, a man who commanded thousands of employees, slowly lowered himself onto one knee. My breath caught in my throat. I stared down at him, paralyzed by the sudden shift in the air. Julian opened a small black velvet box. Inside, resting against white silk, was the most breathtaking piece of jewelry I had ever seen. It was a flawless blue diamond surrounded by a halo of brilliant white stones set in heavy platinum. It caught the dim hallway light and sparkled with oceanic fire. "I did not buy this to impress you with my wealth, Sarah," he said softly, looking up into my eyes with absolute devotion. "I bought this because blue diamonds are formed under extreme pressure and they are completely unbreakable, just like you. I know you have to go back into the dark for a few more weeks. I know I have to let you fight this final battle on your own terms. I will wait until you are ready to destroy them. But I need you to know that after that night, you will never fight alone again. After that night, you will be my wife." I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor and threw my arms around his neck, kissing him with every ounce of love and relief I had stored in my battered heart. I said yes a dozen times. He slipped the heavy platinum band onto my ring finger. It was a perfect fit. For one beautiful hour, we sat on the floor, holding each other, dreaming of a future where my toxic family could never reach us. But the brutal reality of our situation quickly crept back in. If my sister or mother saw a $2 million blue diamond on my hand, the entire operation would instantly collapse. Trent would realize I had powerful backing, and the stolen money would disappear forever. We could not risk it. Julian removed a sturdy platinum chain from his own neck. He carefully threaded my engagement ring onto it, fastened the clasp around my neck, and tucked the heavy diamond safely beneath my sweater, right against my racing heart. For the next 3 days, I wore that ring hidden beneath my modest blouses. It felt like a warm shield against their daily cruelty. Every time my father yelled at me to fetch his coffee, or Chloe mocked my sensible shoes, I would press my hand against my chest, feeling the solid shape of my future hidden beneath the fabric. I felt invincible. I felt like I could endure absolutely anything they threw at me because I knew exactly how the story was going to end. But my newfound confidence made me slightly careless. That following Sunday, my parents demanded I attend the morning service at our local church to maintain the perfect family image. I sat in the wooden pew, wearing a high-necked floral dress, listening to the pastor preach about honesty. It was suffocating. The sanctuary was warm, and I reached up to adjust my collar, pulling the fabric slightly away from my skin to let the air in. I did not realize the platinum chain had shifted. I did not realize that a single flash of silver had caught the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. I only realized my mistake when I turned my head and saw my mother staring intently at my collarbone, her eyes narrowed with sharp and sudden suspicion. Sunday morning arrived with bright sunlight and the ringing of heavy bronze bells at the largest community church in our wealthy Chicago suburb. For the Bennett family, attending church was never about faith. It was a weekly theatrical performance. It was a chance to display their perfect lives to the rest of the neighborhood. I parked my old battered car at the very back of the parking lot while my parents and my sister pulled up to the front entrance in their luxury vehicles. I walked into the grand sanctuary a few steps behind them, playing my assigned role perfectly. I was the quiet, unmarried daughter who carried my mother's heavy coat and held the programs. Growing up in our household, I learned early that love came with a strict ranking system. My sister Chloe was always at the absolute top of that list, and I was always at the bottom. Today was no different. My mother, Patricia, wore a pristine white silk suit, smiling warmly and greeting every prominent business owner in the aisles. My father, Richard, shook hands with the church elders, projecting the image of a wise and generous patriarch. But the real star of the morning was Trent. My brother-in-law walked down the center aisle in a custom-tailored suit, waving to people like he was a visiting celebrity. I walked behind them, keeping my head down, feeling the heavy platinum chain resting against my collarbone beneath my high-necked blouse. Hidden underneath my clothes, resting right over my heart, was the priceless blue diamond engagement ring Julian Cole had given me. We took our seats in the third row. The wooden pews were polished, and the stained glass windows cast beautiful colors across the congregation. The choir sang a beautiful hymn about honesty and salvation. I sat there, listening to the music, surrounded by my family, and felt completely disgusted. They were sitting in a house of worship, bowing their heads in prayer, while actively executing a massive federal fraud scheme. They built their comfortable life on my silence and my forced sacrifices. They were fully prepared to let me go to federal prison so they could keep up this wealthy facade. The music faded and the senior pastor stepped up to the wooden pulpit. He adjusted his microphone and smiled out at the massive crowd. Before we begin today's sermon, he announced, his voice echoing through the large room, I want to take a special moment to acknowledge a remarkable act of generosity. Our community center building fund has been struggling for months, but this week, a young couple in our congregation stepped forward with a truly staggering financial gift. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what was coming. The pastor extended his hand toward our pew. Trent and Chloe, would you please stand? The congregation began to applaud. Trent stood up slowly, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with a look of deep manufactured humility. Chloe stood beside him, placing a manicured hand over her heart, looking overwhelmed by the praise. They donated $50,000 to the church building fund, the pastor declared. They are a shining example of success and moral duty. Let us thank them for their incredible blessing to our community. The applause grew louder. People in the rows around us were leaning over to shake Trent's hand and congratulate my father on having such a successful and generous son-in-law. I sat frozen in my seat. My hands gripped the edges of the wooden pew so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. $50,000. I knew exactly where that money came from. I had seen the digital routing numbers on Trent's computer just a few days ago. That was not a generous donation from a successful businessman. That was stolen capital directly siphoned from Julian Cole's corporate escrow accounts. Trent was using stolen money to buy moral superiority and public adoration in a church. The sheer breathtaking hypocrisy of it made me physically sick. I looked at my mother. Patricia was wiping a fake tear of pride from her eye, beaming at her golden child. I wanted to stand up right there in the middle of the sanctuary and scream the truth. I wanted to tell the pastor that the money was dirty, but I remembered Julian's warning. I had to wait. I had to let them feel utterly secure until the trap was perfectly set. I forced myself to clap along with the rest of the congregation, swallowing my absolute rage. After the service concluded, the congregation moved into the fellowship hall for coffee and pastries. It was crowded and loud. I stood in the corner near the coffee urns, trying to stay out of the way, while my family accepted more praise. The room was warm, and I reached up to adjust the collar of my blouse, pulling the fabric slightly away from my neck to let some air in. It was a tiny, careless movement, but it was a massive mistake. I felt a sharp tug on my sleeve. I turned around and saw my mother standing right beside me. Her eyes were not looking at my face. Her gaze was locked entirely on my collarbone. The platinum chain holding Julian's ring had slipped out from beneath the fabric of my blouse, catching the bright fluorescent light of the fellowship hall. "What is that around your neck?" Patricia demanded, her voice dropping to a low, suspicious whisper. My heart stopped beating. Complete terror flooded my veins. If she pulled that chain, if she saw the massive blue diamond attached to the end of it, everything would be over. Trent would know I had a secret benefactor. He would panic, destroy the servers, and wipe the offshore accounts. Julian would lose his money, and I would lose my freedom. I had exactly 1 second to save myself. I did not try to hide the chain. I looked down at it and offered a sad, pathetic sigh. "Oh, this," I pulled the chain up just enough to show the cheap metal clasp at the back of my neck, carefully keeping the ring hidden deep under my shirt. "It is just a cheap necklace I bought online a few weeks ago." My mother's eyes narrowed, scanning my face for a lie. "Why are you wearing it hidden under your clothes?" she interrogated, her tone sharp and accusatory. I leaned into the role they had forced me to play my entire life. I lowered my eyes, making myself look deeply embarrassed and completely miserable. Because it is fake, Mom. I bought it on a cheap jewelry website. I just wanted to wear something that felt heavy, something that made me feel like someone actually cared enough to buy me a nice gift. I know it is pathetic, but I am 35 and completely alone. I just wanted to pretend for a few hours that I had someone special in my life. It was a humiliating script, but I knew it was the only thing she would believe. I knew her ego thrived on my misery. Patricia stared at me for a long moment. I watched the suspicion slowly drain from her face, replaced instantly by unfiltered, cruel contempt. She let go of my sleeve and took a step back, looking at me like I was a piece of trash that had washed up on her pristine shoes. "You are 35 years old, Sarah," she sneered, her voice dripping with disgust. "Buying fake jewelry on the internet to pretend you have a boyfriend is not just pathetic, it is deeply disturbing. You need to stop living in a fantasy world and accept reality. No wealthy man is ever going to swoop in and save you. Stop embarrassing yourself and go fetch your father a cup of coffee." She turned on her heel and walked back into the crowd to join her wealthy friends. She did not look back. I stood in the corner of the fellowship hall alone. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline, but a cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. I reached up and pressed my hand flat against my chest, feeling the solid, heavy reality of the $2 million diamond resting safely against my skin. My mother thought she had just put me in my place. She thought she had reminded me of my total worthlessness. She had no idea that the wealthy man she said did not exist was currently preparing to tear her entire world apart, and that her pathetic, invisible daughter was holding the match that would burn their fraudulent empire to the ground. I stood completely still in the corner of the crowded fellowship hall as my mother walked away from me. Her cruel words still echoed in my ears, a sharp reminder of my permanent place at the very bottom of the Bennett family ranking system. I reached up and pressed my hand flat against my chest, feeling the heavy platinum chain hidden beneath my high-necked floral blouse. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath, trying to block out the loud chatter of the wealthy congregation around me. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to fit into their version of who I should be, accepting the role of the invisible workhorse while they polished their perfect public image. I was always the acceptable sacrifice in this family, the one whose feelings were constantly dismissed, so my sister could continue to shine unconditionally. I opened my eyes and turned to walk back into the main sanctuary to gather our heavy winter coats. The massive room was mostly empty now, the towering stained glass windows casting long, colorful shadows across the polished wooden pews. The quiet atmosphere felt like a heavy blanket after the chaotic noise of the fellowship hall. I walked slowly down the side aisle, keeping my head bowed, playing the role of the meek and obedient daughter they demanded me to be. Then I saw him. Sitting in the very last row, partially hidden by the dark shadow of the balcony overhang, was a man wearing a dark wool coat and a casual flat cap pulled low over his forehead. To anyone else in the congregation, he was just a random visitor seeking a quiet moment of Sunday prayer. But I would recognize the sharp line of that jaw and those intense, calculating blue eyes anywhere in the world. It was Julian Cole. My heart did a violent, terrifying flip in my chest. We had explicitly agreed that it was entirely too dangerous to be seen together in public. My brother-in-law Trent was paranoid and he had eyes everywhere. The Bennett family was deeply embedded in this suburban community, and if anyone recognized the billionaire CEO of Cole Logistics sitting in our local church, the entire federal operation would collapse instantly. But Julian had not stayed away. He had driven across the city in disguise. He had sat in the back pew for the entire morning service. He had witnessed the senior pastor praising Trent for his generous charitable donation. He had watched my parents parade down the center aisle, playing the role of the devoted, faithful, and morally superior couple. Most importantly, he had seen exactly how they treated me. He had watched from the shadows as my mother sneered at me, as my father ignored me, as my sister treated me like a hired servant. He had witnessed the psychological abuse firsthand. I knew I could not approach him directly. That would have been catastrophic. Instead, I walked toward the wooden coat rack near the vestibule, pretending to search through the garments for my father's heavy overcoat. I kept my back turned to the sanctuary, my hands busy shifting the fabric on the hangers. I heard the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps walking up the center aisle. Julian stood up and slowly walked toward the main exit, passing right behind me. He did not stop. He did not turn his head to look at me, but as he walked by, his broad shoulder brushed gently against mine, and his deep voice dropped to a barely audible, furious whisper. "I saw how she looked at you," he murmured, the suppressed anger radiating from him like heat from a blast furnace. "I saw everything they do to you. It ends now." The Federal Bureau of Investigation has the final server logs. The Securities and Exchange Commission approved the absolute asset freeze this morning. We have all the evidence we need. I kept my hands busy with the coats, my breath catching painfully in my throat. "When do we move?" I whispered back to the empty air, knowing he was still close enough to hear my voice. Friday night, Julian's voice floated back to me, cold, absolute, and carrying the weight of an executioner. "The anniversary dinner. Make sure they are all in that room. Wear the black dress I bought you. It is time to burn them down." I heard the heavy oak doors of the church open and close with a solid thud. He was gone. I stood in the vestibule, holding my father's overcoat, my hands shaking so violently I had to grip the rough wool fabric to steady myself. The federal trap was officially set. After months of gathering evidence in the dark, after enduring endless humiliation and watching my family live like royalty on stolen money, the end was finally in sight. Friday night was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. It was supposed to be the grandest social event of their entire year. Now it was going to be the stage for their complete and utter destruction. They had built their comfortable life on my silence and my forced sacrifices, never once considering that the foundation might eventually crack. I took a long, shaky breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down to a normal pace, and walked back towards the fellowship hall to deliver the coat. The room was still packed with congregants drinking terrible coffee and eating dry pastries. My mother was holding court near the dessert table, laughing brightly at something a church elder had said. My father was patting Trent on the back, looking like the proudest patriarch in the world. I watched them perform their perfect family routine, marveling at how easily they wore their masks of moral superiority. As I approached them, the senior pastor clinked a silver spoon against his ceramic coffee mug. The sharp chiming sound cut through the loud chatter, bringing the fellowship hall to a quiet and respectful halt. "Friends," the pastor announced, beaming widely at the crowd. "Before we all head home for our Sunday rest, our dear brother Trent has asked to share a quick word of celebration with our church family." Trent stepped forward, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He smiled that smug, arrogant smile that I had grown to absolutely despise. He looked around the room, soaking in the admiration of the crowd, playing the role of the brilliant corporate executive to absolute perfection. "Thank you, Pastor Trent," said his voice dripping with false humility. "As many of you know, our family business has been working incredibly hard this year to secure the future of our employees and our beautiful community. I am deeply blessed to announce that this coming Friday, I will be officially closing a massive new corporate acquisition. It is a monumental deal that will secure our family legacy for generations to come. God has truly blessed our hard work." The room erupted in enthusiastic applause. My father cheered loudly. My sister Chloe threw her arms around Trent's neck, kissing his cheek with a bright, performative smile. My mother wiped a dramatic tear of joy from her eye, looking at her son-in-law like he was a savior. I stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. The heavy overcoat slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor, but nobody noticed. I was completely invisible to them, just as I had always been. But I was the only person in that room who knew the terrifying truth about Trent's proud public announcement. There was no corporate acquisition. There was no legitimate business expansion. I knew exactly what was scheduled for this coming Friday. I had seen the digital routing numbers. I had tracked the offshore shell companies in the dead of night. The huge new deal Trent was bragging about to the entire church was the final, irreversible wire transfer. He was preparing to move $3 million of Julian Cole's money out of the domestic escrow accounts and into an untraceable bank in the Cayman Islands. If that transfer went through, the money would be gone forever. Julian would lose his capital, and the digital signature authorizing the massive theft would belong entirely to me. Trent was not securing a family legacy. I was locking the door to my federal prison cell. I looked down at my watch, my blood running completely cold. Friday was exactly 5 days away. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had just become a matter of absolute life and death. The final week, leading up to my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, felt like an elaborate and grueling punishment designed specifically to break my spirit. While my mother and sister spent their afternoons drinking champagne at high-end bridal boutiques, searching for the perfect designer gowns to wear to the event, I was forced to handle all the organization entirely on my own. I spent my days desperately contacting restaurants, arranging the massive floral displays, and physically carrying heavy boxes of supplies into the venue. I was 35 years old, a certified public accountant who had just uncovered a $3 million federal fraud scheme, yet my family still treated me like an unpaid servant. They did not offer to pay a single dime toward the deposits or the vendor fees. When the restaurant required a final confirmation charge to secure the private dining room, my father conveniently ignored my phone calls. I was forced to put the massive expense on my own personal credit card, a card that was already stretched to its absolute limit because of the crushing financial demands they had placed on me over the years. I spent hours on the phone negotiating with temperamental caterers, verifying dietary restrictions for 50 elite guests, and organizing the complicated seating charts. My parents contributed absolutely nothing to the effort, preferring to sit in their luxurious suburban home while I ran myself completely ragged across the city. The physical toll was exhausting. On the Wednesday before the party, I spent 4 hours hauling heavy wooden centerpieces and heavy crates of crystal glassware up the back stairwell of the restaurant because the main freight elevator was out of service. My hands were blistered, my cheap Sensible shoes were scuffed, and my back ached terribly, but I did not complain. I hauled the boxes and arranged the tables with a strange, quiet sense of determination. Every heavy box I carried felt like one step closer to the end of my miserable sentence. The true extent of their cruelty was on full display Thursday afternoon, just 24 hours before the event. My mother, Patricia, and my sister, Chloe, finally decided to grace the venue with their presence for a final walkthrough. They arrived in my mother's pristine white Range Rover, stepping into the private dining room, wearing expensive cashmere sweaters and smelling of high-end perfume. I was standing on a tall stepladder in the corner of the room, my hair tied back in a messy knot, trying to hang a heavy silk banner that spelled out a happy anniversary message. Patricia walked slowly around the room, running her manicured fingers over the chairs and inspecting the floral arrangements with a highly critical eye. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not say thank you for the countless hours of manual labor I had poured into her celebration. Instead, she stopped at the head table, picked up the edge of the fabric draped over the wood, and let out a loud, dramatic sigh of absolute disgust. "Sarah, what on earth is this material?" my mother demanded, her voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceilings of the restaurant. I climbed down from the stepladder and wiped my dusty hands on my slacks. I told her they were the standard white linen tablecloths provided by the restaurant catering package. I explained that upgrading to the imported Egyptian silk covers she originally wanted would have cost an additional $2,000 money that she had explicitly refused to give me. My mother dropped this fabric like it was infected with a disease. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing with pure contempt. She began scolding me relentlessly right there in the middle of the empty dining room, loudly complaining that I had deliberately chosen tablecloths that were far too cheap. She accused me of trying to embarrass the family in front of our wealthy neighbors and corporate partners. She said I had absolutely no taste, no sense of elegance, and that it was completely typical of me to ruin the aesthetic of her milestone celebration just to save a few pennies. Chloe chimed in, immediately crossing her arms and shaking her blonde head in mock disappointment. She told our mother that they never should have trusted me with something so important. Chloe laughed a cold, sharp laugh and said that someone who buys her clothes on clearance racks could not possibly be expected to understand true luxury. They stood together in the center of that beautiful room, a united front of toxic superiority, completely dismantling my exhausting efforts while offering absolutely no solutions or financial help of their own. I stood quietly near the stepladder, absorbing their verbal abuse, just as I had done for my entire life. The old Sarah, the desperate daughter who just wanted to belong to a family that loved her, would have crumbled into a million pieces. She would have apologized profusely, cried hot tears of shame, and frantically called the rental company, begging them to rush deliver the expensive silk linens at her own personal expense. But I just lowered my head and offered a pathetic, hollow apology. I promised them I would try to fix the ambient lighting in the room to make the fabric look better. I played the role of the defeated, miserable slave of the party perfectly. I let them feel incredibly powerful. I let them believe they had successfully put me in my proper place. They had no idea that beneath my cheap sweat-stained shirt, I was wearing a $2 million blue diamond engagement ring pressed flat against my beating heart. They did not know that while I was organizing their cheap tablecloths, my brilliant billionaire fiancé, Julian Cole, was actively coordinating a massive raid with federal prosecutors. They thought I was a pathetic loser who would spend the rest of her life cleaning up their messes and managing their events. They did not realize that I was meticulously setting the stage for their total destruction. When my mother and sister finally left the restaurant to go get their nails done for the big night, I stood alone in the quiet dining room. I looked at the long tables, the gleaming silverware, and the cheap linen tablecloths that had caused so much manufactured outrage. I smiled a slow, completely cold smile. Let them complain about the fabric. Let them worry about the aesthetic of the room. By tomorrow night, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would be walking through those heavy oak doors. My family was about to lose their house, their cars, their stolen millions, and their absolute freedom. The cheap tablecloths were going to be the very least of their problems. The morning of my parents' 40th wedding anniversary arrived with crisp and clear weather. While normal families might spend such a milestone morning reminiscing or sharing quiet moments of gratitude, the Bennett family spent it wrapped in pure vanity. My mother, Patricia, and my sister, Chloe, had booked a private session at an exclusive bridal and evening wear boutique in downtown Chicago. They were sipping complimentary champagne and being fitted for custom silk gowns paid for entirely with stolen capital. I was not invited to join them. I was banished to the quiet and empty family office with strict orders from my mother to handle the final caterer payments and confirm the massive floral deliveries. Trent had strolled into the office at 10 o'clock that morning, wearing a smug smile and a custom-tailored suit. He walked straight to his corner office, completely oblivious to the fact that his empire was currently sitting on a federal tripwire. He told his secretaries he was leaving early for a celebratory lunch at his private golf club. Before he walked out the heavy glass doors, he stopped by my desk and tossed a stack of dry cleaning receipts onto my keyboard. He told me to make sure they were expensed properly and reminded me not to be late to the restaurant that night because someone needed to direct the valet parking. I smiled my blank and obedient smile. I told him to have a wonderful lunch. The second the doors closed behind him, the obedient daughter vanished. I locked the main office doors and sat down at the master compliance terminal. This was the point of no absolute return. Trent had bragged to the entire church congregation that he was closing a massive new deal. I knew exactly what that deal actually was. It was the final $3 million wire transfer. He was attempting to move the last remaining chunk of Julian Cole's money out of the domestic escrow accounts and into his untraceable offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He had scheduled the massive transfer to execute at exactly 4:45 that afternoon, right before the international banking windows closed for the weekend. If that money crossed international borders, Julian would lose his capital forever, and the digital authorization signature would point directly to my computer. I logged into the highly secure corporate banking portal. My hands were sweating so badly I had to wipe them on my cheap slacks. I navigated past the daily ledgers and the domestic payroll accounts, driving deep into the administrative settings. Trent was the chief executive officer, but he was incredibly lazy. He relied entirely on my certified public accountant credentials to manage the complex federal compliance protocols. Because of that laziness, he had never realized that I possessed the ultimate banking override. It was a federal failsafe, known as a hard compliance freeze, designed to instantly lock all corporate assets if a chief accountant suspected active financial fraud. It was essentially a digital kill switch. If I triggered the freeze, every single corporate account, every escrow hold, and every linked personal credit card bearing the Bennett name would be instantly and irrevocably locked. They would not be able to transfer a single dollar. They would not be able to buy a cup of coffee. The entire financial network would be paralyzed pending a full federal audit. But timing was absolutely critical. If I froze the accounts too early, Trent might try to pay for an expensive bottle of wine at his country club lunch. His card would decline. He would immediately call the bank, discover the compliance lock, and panic. He would realize I had betrayed him, and he would completely destroy the local servers before the Federal Bureau of Investigation could secure the building. I had to let him feel powerful and secure all day. I had to wait until the absolute last possible second. I sat in the dead silent office for 6 agonizing hours. I watched the clock on the wall tick away the afternoon. I pictured my sister Chloe twirling in a $10,000 dress, laughing at her own reflection. I pictured my mother bragging to the boutique staff about her brilliant and wealthy son-in-law. I pictured my father getting a professional shave and a haircut. They had built their entire kingdom of arrogance on my back. They had fully intended to let me rot in a federal prison, just so they could keep wearing designer clothes. At 4:30 in the afternoon, I pulled up the pending wire transfer queue. There it was. $3 million waiting for final clearance. The destination was a blind trust in the Cayman Islands. The authorization signature was mine. There it was. I watched the digital clock on my second monitor. 4:40. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. 4:42. I placed my finger on the mouse. 4:44. I took a deep and ragged breath, thinking about the lifetime of humiliation I had endured in this family. At exactly 4:45, just as the automated system prepared to sweep the funds offshore, I clicked the compliance override button. A warning box popped up on the screen, asking me to confirm the total asset freeze. I typed in my unique security credentials and hit the enter key. The screen froze for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the entire banking dashboard flashed bright red. A bold notification appeared across the center of the monitor. All accounts restricted. Status frozen. Federal compliance lock activated. I did not stop there. I went into the secondary credit systems and locked every single corporate card assigned to my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law. The stolen money was officially trapped. The offshore transfer was completely blocked. The Bennett family was entirely bankrupt, and they did not even know it yet. I logged out of the terminal, wiped the local cache memory, and shut down the computer. The silence in the office felt completely different now. It was not the silence of a prison. It was the quiet aftermath of a massive demolition. I grabbed my worn-out coat, walked out of the building, and drove back to my small apartment. I stood in my bedroom an hour later, staring at a large black garment bag hanging on the back of my closet door. Julian had sent it to me secretly 3 days ago. Inside was a black silk evening gown tailored perfectly to my measurements. It was a dress meant for a woman who commanded respect, not a woman who directed valet parking. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. My phone vibrated loudly on the wooden dresser, shattering the quiet of my apartment. I reached down and picked it up. It was a text message from Julian Cole. I stared at the screen, reading the words that would officially mark the end of my old life. The message was short, but it carried the devastating weight of a nuclear strike. "The federal arrest warrant has been signed," Julian wrote. "The lockdown team is ready and in position. Wear the most beautiful dress I prepared for you. I will see you tonight." I stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the heavy oak doors of the private dining room at Le Petit Chateau. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The faint sound of a classical string quartet drifted through the thick wooden panels along with the loud and arrogant laughter of my family. I was wearing the cheap, oversized black wool coat. I always wore the one my mother constantly complained made me look like a homeless person, but hidden completely beneath that heavy, scratchy fabric was the breathtaking black silk evening gown Julian had sent me. And resting cold and heavy against my skin, safely out of sight, was the $2 million blue diamond engagement ring. I took a deep and steadying breath, letting the cool air of the restaurant hallway fill my lungs. For my entire life, standing outside these family gatherings had always filled me with a deep, suffocating sense of dread. I used to physically shake before walking into a room with my parents and my sister, knowing I was about to endure hours of casual cruelty. But tonight, I felt absolutely no fear. I felt a dangerous, electric sense of calm. The federal compliance lock was fully engaged. The offshore accounts were entirely frozen. The trap was flawlessly set. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and slipped quietly into the golden glow of the VIP room. The space was filled with 50 wealthy guests dressed in their finest formal wear, drinking expensive champagne and celebrating my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. Nobody noticed me enter. I walked over to the dark corner near the swinging kitchen doors, taking my familiar place in the shadows. I arrived just in time to watch my younger sister step into the center of the room. Chloe was wearing her shimmering designer gown, holding a crystal flute of imported champagne. She tapped the side of her glass with a silver spoon. The delicate chiming sound brought all the wealthy guests to a quiet halt. She smiled her perfect, expensive smile, soaking in the undivided attention of the room. She gave a beautiful, entirely fabricated speech about our parents and their perfect marriage. Then, just as she had planned, her eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto me, standing in the corner. Her expression shifted from sweet devotion to calculated malice. And a round of applause for my older sister, Sarah Chloe, announced. Her voice carried loudly, slicing through the quiet room. She pointed her manicured finger directly at me. 35 years old, still hopelessly single, still driving that old battered Honda, and still just a lowly employee working for our dad. It is terribly embarrassing for her, but at least she is useful for running errands and cleaning up the messes at this party. Let us give her a hand for being such a good little helper. Polite, uncomfortable applause rippled through the crowd, but my mother threw her head back and laughed the loudest. Patricia wiped a tear of pure mirth from her eye, thoroughly enjoying my public humiliation. I did not blink. I did not look down at my cheap shoes. I stood perfectly still and let their laughter wash over me. My father, Richard, decided he needed to capitalize on the moment. He stood up from his seat at the head table, holding a glass of expensive scotch. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit and smiled warmly at the crowd, playing the role of the wise and successful patriarch. "Now let us not be too hard on Sarah," my father said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "We all have different capacities in life. But Sarah, you really should take some notes from your brother-in-law. Trent is the true definition of a winner." Trent is finalizing a massive new corporate acquisition as we speak. A multi-million-dollar deal that will secure our family legacy for generations to come. That is what real success looks like. The room erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. Trent sat next to my sister, leaning back in his chair with a look of absolute, unfiltered arrogance. He raised his glass to my father, accepting the praise of the room. I stared at Trent, keeping my face completely blank. A multi-million-dollar deal. I knew exactly what he was bragging about to these people. I was talking about the final $3 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. He truly believed he had just successfully stolen the last massive chunk of Julian Cole's money. He was sitting there drinking expensive wine, completely oblivious to the fact that his digital transfer had slammed directly into a federal compliance wall hours ago. He had no idea. His accounts were locked, his credit cards were frozen, and his legacy was currently being dismantled by federal prosecutors. The applause died down, and the guests returned to their expensive meals. My mother, Patricia, noticed me still standing by the kitchen doors. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh of annoyance, acting as if my mere presence was a burden on her perfect evening. She snapped her manicured fingers in my direction, treating me exactly like a hired servant. "Sarah, do not just stand there looking pathetic and ruining the aesthetic of the room," my mother ordered, her voice sharp and loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "The bread baskets on table 4 are completely empty. Go into the kitchen and tell the catering staff to bring us more warm bread immediately. And do something about your hair. You look like a complete mess." For 35 years, that snap of her fingers would have sent me scurrying into the kitchen. I would have rushed to fetch her bread, desperate to please her, desperate to avoid causing a scene. I would have swallowed my pride, hidden my tears, and done exactly what I was told. But the woman they had abused, exploited, and planned to send to federal prison was completely gone. I did not move toward the kitchen. I did not lower my head. I stood in the shadows of the beautiful room, feeling the heavy platinum chain resting against my collarbone. I looked at my mother sitting at the center of her fraudulent kingdom, wearing jewelry paid for by stolen money. I looked at my sister smirking at me over her champagne glass. I looked at my brother-in-law, the arrogant thief who thought he was a mastermind. I smiled. The time for being small was officially over. I did not go to the kitchen. I did not fetch the bread. For 35 years, my family relied on my absolute obedience, counting on my fear of causing a scene to keep me firmly in my place. They expected me to lower my head, swallow the humiliation, and scurry into the shadows to do exactly what my mother ordered. But their power over me was an illusion I had finally shattered. I stepped out of the dark corner and walked directly into the center of the crowded VIP dining room. The heavy crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant golden light across the polished dance floor, illuminating my path. A few wealthy guests glanced in my direction, expecting me to hurry past them to fulfill my catering duties. Instead, I stopped right in the middle of the room, directly in front of the head table where my sister and brother-in-law sat, reveling in their stolen glory. My mother, Patricia, frowned deeply, her manicured hands fluttering in annoyance. She opened her mouth to reprimand me, to remind me of my lowly status in front of her important friends. But before she could utter a single word, I reached up and unbuttoned the cheap, oversized black wool coat I wore to cover myself. I let the scratchy fabric slide off my shoulders and drop carelessly onto the pristine hardwood floor. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the quiet room. Beneath that hideous coat was not the faded clearance rack clothing my family expected. I was wearing a breathtaking black silk evening gown. It had been custom tailored for me by a master designer in Milan, a magnificent gift from Julian. The fabric moved like dark liquid shadow, catching the chandelier light. It fit me with uncompromising perfection, transforming my posture into a woman who commanded undeniable authority. The physical transformation was so absolute and entirely unexpected that the room descended into a stunned, heavy hush. The polite and formal dinner chatter died away completely. Even the professional string quartet in the corner faltered, pausing as the musicians openly stared at me. My father Richard froze with his glass of expensive scotch suspended halfway to his mouth. My mother looked as though she had been physically struck her brain, failing to compute how her invisible, pathetic daughter was suddenly radiating a level of elegance that made her own outfit look utterly ordinary and cheap in comparison. Chloe simply stared, her mouth hanging open, the malicious smirk wiped from her perfectly painted face. She gripped the edge of the linen-covered table, her knuckles turning white, utterly paralyzed by the sudden dramatic shift in the room's dynamic. But I was not finished. I raised my hands to the back of my neck and unhooked the simple metal clasp of the chain hidden beneath my collar. I pulled the heavy platinum chain forward, letting the object attached to it catch the brilliant ambient light of the dining room. It was the $2 million blue diamond engagement ring Julian had given me to mark our secret alliance. I slid the heavy ring off the chain, holding it delicately between my fingers for just a fraction of a second, letting the massive, flawless stone flash with oceanic fire. Then, with slow, deliberate confidence, I slid the heavy platinum band onto the ring finger of my left hand. If the custom Italian silk gown had silenced the room, the blue diamond completely suffocated it. You did not need to be a gemologist to understand the staggering value of the stone now resting on my hand. It was a piece of jewelry that belonged in a royal vault, not on the finger of a 35-year-old single accountant. The blinding sparkle of the rare diamond seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of the room. A wealthy socialite seated nearest to me let out a sharp gasp, her eyes wide with shock. The cruel narrative my family had spun about my pathetic, impoverished existence was crumbling into dust right before their very eyes. I locked eyes with my younger sister. Chloe looked like she was physically struggling to breathe. Her entire sense of superiority was built entirely on the firm foundation of my ongoing failure. Seeing me stand there radiating immense wealth and absolute confidence was systematically destroying her fragile reality. But it was Trent's reaction that was the most rewarding to witness. My brother-in-law, the arrogant chief executive who bragged to a church congregation about his massive corporate acquisition, was no longer smiling. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He stared at the blue diamond on my finger, his eyes widening in pure terror. He knew the quiet woman standing in front of him had somehow acquired financial and legal backing far more powerful than he could ever comprehend. His hands began to shake so violently that his wine glass rattled loudly against the wooden table. I stood tall in the center of the completely silent ballroom, letting them drown in their own deep confusion. I did not say a single word. I did not need to explain myself to them or beg for their approval ever again. I just let the cold, undeniable truth of my sudden transformation crush their arrogant spirits. The heavy atmosphere in the room was stretched so remarkably tight, it felt like a piano wire ready to snap. My mother, Patricia, finally managed to stand up her expensive chair, scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She opened her mouth, ready to aggressively reassert her absolute control over the daughter she had always commanded. She wanted to scream at me to force me back into the tiny invisible box where I had spent my entire adult life. But she never got the slightest chance to speak her cruel words. The heavy double oak doors of the restaurant burst open violently. The loud crash echoed over the stunned silence of the VIP dining room, causing several wealthy guests to gasp and grip the edges of their linen-covered tables. Julian Cole walked through the doorway. He did not look like a man arriving late to a polite social gathering. He looked like a man arriving to execute a hostile corporate takeover. He wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit with no tie and his dark hair swept back. His presence radiated an absolute and quiet authority that immediately sucked the remaining oxygen out of the ballroom. Behind him walked two imposing figures. One was a massive private bodyguard in a black suit, standing with his hands folded professionally in front of him. The other man wore a standard government windbreaker, with a gold badge clipped prominently to his leather belt, identifying him as a senior agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Trent. My brother-in-law had been sitting back in his chair, just moments ago, practically swimming in his own manufactured arrogance. But the exact second he saw Julian Cole step into the warm light of the crystal chandeliers, Trent completely fell apart. The expensive crystal wine glass he was holding slipped right through his trembling fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending dark red wine pooling across the floorboards like blood. The sharp sound of breaking glass made my sister jump, but Trent did not even look down. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickening shade of pale gray. His eyes were wide with pure, unfiltered terror. He knew exactly who had just walked into the room. I was staring directly at the billionaire whose money he had been actively stealing for 2 years. My mother, Patricia, however, had absolutely no idea who Julian was. She only knew that some stranger had just violently interrupted her perfect 40th anniversary celebration and drawn attention away from her. Her face flushed with immediate, indignant rage. She marched right past Trent with her expensive heels clicking loudly against the floor, positioning herself as the fierce protector of her own highly curated social image. She squared her shoulders, adjusted her diamond necklace, and glared at the billionaire. "Excuse me," my mother demanded, her voice shrill and echoing with that familiar toxic authority she used to bully everyone around her. "This is a private family event. I have absolutely no idea who you think you are, but you are not on the approved guest list. I suggest you turn around and leave this room right now before I have the restaurant management call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." Julian did not even blink. He did not look at my mother. He treated her with the exact same level of dismissive invisibility that she had subjected me to for 35 years. He walked right past her, as if she were nothing more than a minor annoyance or a piece of cheap furniture blocking his designated path. Patricia gasped, her mouth falling open in sheer, unadulterated outrage. She looked back at my father for support, but Richard was too confused by the presence of the federal agent to speak. Nobody had ever ignored my mother like that in her entire life. Julian stopped right in front of me in the center of the ballroom. He looked at the custom black silk gown he had designed for me in Milan. He looked at the massive blue diamond resting securely on my left hand. Then he looked up into my eyes, and the cold, terrifying expression on his handsome face instantly melted into something incredibly warm and deeply profound. He reached out gently, took my trembling hand in his, and bowed his head. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss against my knuckles. "I am so sorry I am late, my beautiful fiancé," he said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the dead silent room. "I had to finalize some rather pressing legal paperwork with our friends at the Federal Bureau before I could join you." The collective gasp from the 50 wealthy guests was so loud, it sounded like the room was inhaling. The murmurs erupted instantly. People were pointing and whispering behind their hands, staring at the billionaire kneeling before the woman they had just been openly mocking. My sister Chloe could not handle the sudden destruction of her reality. Her entire identity and her entire fragile ego was built on the absolute certainty that I was a pathetic, unlovable loser. Seeing a handsome, incredibly powerful man kissing my hand completely broke her mind. She slammed her hands down on the linen tablecloth and shrieked, "Are you insane?" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with desperate manic panic as she pointed a shaking manicured finger at me. "You actually hired an actor. You paid some random guy to come in here and pretend to be engaged to you just to ruin my parents' anniversary. You are so pathetic, Sarah. You are absolutely psychotic." Chloe turned to her husband, fully expecting him to join in on the cruel mockery and expecting him to validate her ridiculous delusion. "Trent, tell them. Tell everyone she is just a crazy jealous spinster making up lies." But Trent did not mock me. He could not even stand up. He was slumped in his chair, sweating profusely and staring at Julian with a look of absolute defeat. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, choking sound came out. Chloe grabbed his shoulder and shook him violently. Her perfect designer dress shifted as she panicked. "Trent, say something to her. Tell her to get out." Trent finally tore his eyes away from Julian and looked up at his frantic wife. His voice came out as a hollow, broken whisper that still managed to carry through the terrifying silence of the ballroom. "Chloe, shut up." He wheezed, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the heavy armrests of his chair to keep from falling onto the floor. "That is not an actor. That is Julian Cole. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Cole Logistics." The name dropped like a physical bomb into the center of the room. My father, Richard, let out a choked, strangled noise, stumbling backward and knocking his chair over. He knew that name perfectly well. He knew the massive corporate entity that provided his family brokerage with their entire livelihood. And suddenly he realized with crushing, paralyzing clarity that the ruthless billionaire owner of that company was holding the hand of the invisible daughter he had spent decades treating like absolute garbage. Julian slowly turned his head away from me and looked directly at Trent. The warmth he had just shown me vanished completely, replaced instantly by the freezing, ruthless gaze of a predator looking at trapped prey. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to yell to command the room. "You are a very perceptive man," Trent Julian said smoothly, stepping protectively to my side and lacing his fingers through mine. "It is a terrible shame you did not use that same perception to realize you were leaving a massive digital footprint every single time you stole money from my company. Did you honestly believe you could frame my future wife for federal wire fraud and I would just let you get away with it?" The heavy double doors shutting behind Julian was not just a physical sound. It was the definitive and terrifying sound of a trap snapping shut. The two federal agents moved into the room with practiced and uncompromising efficiency. One agent secured the main exit, while the other positioned himself firmly in front of the kitchen doors. The lead agent, a tall man wearing a standard government windbreaker, reached into his jacket and held up a gold badge for the entire room to see. He announced in a loud, booming voice that the banquet hall was officially sealed under a federal warrant and instructed everyone to remain exactly where they were. A wave of pure panic rippled through the 50 wealthy guests. People gasped, clutching their champagne glasses, unsure if they were witnessing a practical joke or a genuine nightmare. Trent immediately tried to stand up and back away from the head table, his eyes darting frantically toward the service hallway. But Julian's massive private bodyguard stepped directly into his path, crossing his arms and blocking any chance of escape. Trent sank back into his chair, his chest heaving with terrified, shallow breaths. Julian gently released my hand and gave me a single encouraging nod. This was my moment. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. I turned to face the room. These were the elite business partners, the church elders, and the wealthy socialites my parents had spent decades trying to impress. I stood tall in my custom black silk gown, the blue diamond flashing on my finger, and I spoke clearly as the primary witness to their massive fraud. I announced to the silent ballroom that for the past 2 years, Trent had established a complex network of offshore shell companies. I laid out the exact figures without a single tremor in my voice. I told them how Trent had systematically siphoned $3 million directly from the corporate escrow accounts of Cole Logistics. My father, Richard, gripped the edge of the table. His face was a sickly shade of purple. He opened his mouth and tried to interrupt me, his voice shaking with desperate anger. He told the crowd I was deeply confused and making a terrible mistake. I looked right into my father's eyes and cut him off. I revealed his exact role in the conspiracy. I told the room that my father was a willing accomplice in federal money laundering. He had deliberately used our family freight brokerage to wash the stolen capital intentionally, pushing the fraudulent approvals through the blind spots in our billing system and designing the paper trail to frame me if they were ever caught. A loud collective gasp echoed from the tables of guests. Several business partners physically leaned away from my father in disgust. Then I turned my attention to my mother and my younger sister. Chloe was trembling violently, her designer silk gown suddenly looking more like a prison uniform than a symbol of status. I pointed directly at her and told the room exactly how they had spent the stolen money. I listed the sprawling mansion in the gated community, the brand new luxury vehicles, and the endless shopping sprees. None of it was earned through hard work or brilliant investments. It was all paid for with stolen money. For my entire life, they had treated me like I was completely worthless, but the truth was they built their comfortable life on my silence. My mother, Patricia, simply refused to surrender her pride. Denial was the only weapon she had left, her face flushed with indignant rage. She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out her heavy platinum credit card. She held it up like a shield, screaming at the federal agents that this was a ridiculous misunderstanding. She yelled that she was going to call the best defense attorneys in the country and sue every single person in the room for defamation. Trying to assert her ultimate dominance, she ordered the terrified restaurant manager in the corner to process her card immediately to pay for the private room so she could leave. At that exact moment, a lawyer from the Securities and Exchange Commission stepped forward from the back of the room. He carried a thick leather briefcase and handed my father a heavy stack of legal documents. He did not speak quietly. He read the federal asset freeze order aloud for everyone to hear. Effective immediately, every corporate account, every personal bank account, every offshore trust, and every piece of real estate tied to the Bennett name was officially locked by the federal government. The restaurant manager, his hands shaking nervously, took my mother's platinum card and swiped it through his mobile payment terminal. The machine beeped loudly, displaying a harsh, glaring red screen. Declined. My mother snatched the card back, her hands trembling, and demanded he run it again. He swiped it a second time. Declined. They were completely and entirely bankrupt. The realization crashed down on them right in that very moment, heavy and suffocating. In the span of 5 minutes, they went from being the wealthiest, most arrogant family in the room to having absolutely nothing. No money, no power, and no reputation. I looked at my parents as their entire fraudulent empire burned to ashes. For 35 years, I believed that love was something you could earn, that if I just gave enough and sacrificed enough, my family would eventually see my value. But I was horribly wrong. Love is not a transaction, and it is not a reward for being useful. I finally understood the brutal reality of my existence in this family. I wasn't strong to them. I was just convenient, and I wasn't reliable. I was simply exploitable. They didn't see me as family, they saw me as staff, and staff has the absolute right to quit. I had spent my whole life trying to prove I was worthy of this family, but I was completely done proving myself to people who used me. 2 federal agents walked directly up to Trent. They asked him to stand up, turn around, and place his hands behind his back. The cold, sharp sound of metal handcuffs clicking into place echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. Trent broke down completely. He began to cry, his chest heaving with loud, pathetic sobs as his arrogant facade shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Chloe watched in absolute horror as her husband was led away in chains. Her knees buckled. She fell to the polished hardwood floor, her perfect hair falling into her tear-streaked face. She looked up at me from the ground, her eyes wide with desperation and pure panic, begging and pleading for me to save her. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room remained firmly shut, guarded by federal agents trapping my family inside the very nightmare they had designed for me. The classical string quartet had packed up their instruments and fled out the back exit minutes ago. The 50 wealthy guests, the elite socialites my mother had spent decades trying to impress, were now practically tripping over each other in their desperate rush to leave the venue. Nobody wanted to be photographed near a family actively being indicted for federal money laundering. I stood perfectly still next to Julian, watching the scene unfold with absolute clarity. 2 agents were pushing Trent against the linen-covered head table, reading him his Miranda rights. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly across the polished hardwood floor. My father. Richard was slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, completely broken by the realization that his entire legacy was built on borrowed time and stolen capital. My mother, Patricia, stood frozen near the abandoned dessert cart. Her platinum credit card was still clutched in her trembling fingers. She looked completely hollowed out, staring at the flashing red lights of the police cruisers, visible through the tall restaurant windows. They had lost their company, their stolen millions, and their pristine reputation in the span of 15 minutes. But the most dramatic collapse was happening right at my feet. My younger sister, Chloe, the golden child who had never faced a single consequence in her entire pampered life, was kneeling on the floor. Her expensive designer silk gown was tangled around her legs, the fabric soaking up the red wine Trent had spilled earlier. She reached out with shaking, manicured hands and grabbed the hem of my black dress. Her perfect makeup was completely ruined. Dark mascara streaming down her flushed cheeks as she sobbed uncontrollably. "Sarah, please!" Chloe wailed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "You have to stop them. Tell the agents it is a mistake. Tell Julian to drop the charges. Please, Sarah, he is my husband. You cannot let them take him away to prison. We are your family. I am your sister." I looked down at her. This was the same woman who less than an hour ago had stood in front of this entire room and mocked my cheap clothes, my old car, and my single relationship status. She had laughed while plotting to let me take the fall for a $3 million federal crime. Now stripped of her stolen wealth and her unearned arrogance, she was begging for the very loyalty she had constantly denied me. I did not pull my dress away. I just stared down at her, feeling a strange, hollow calmness settle over my heart. For 35 years, I had bent over backwards trying to earn a place at their table. I had accepted the leftover affection, the constant criticism, and the cruel jokes because I thought that was what family required. I believed my parents when they said I was just the reliable workhorse who needed to make sacrifices. But looking at Chloe sobbing on the floor, I finally understood the brutal truth. They never loved me. They only loved what they could extract from me. I was not strong to them. I was convenient, and I was not reliable. I was just exploitable. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the final shreds of my misplaced guilt dissolve into the cold Chicago air. I looked right into my sister's terrified eyes. "You are 35 years old, Sarah," I said softly, perfectly echoing the cruel, mocking tone she had used during her toast. Chloe stopped crying for a fraction of a second, looking up at me with wide, confused eyes. Still single, I continued, my voice steady and sharp as glass. Still a complete failure, and totally pathetic. "Is that not what you told this entire room tonight?" Chloe opened her mouth, stammering, trying to form a desperate apology, but I did not let her speak. I leaned down just an inch, making sure she heard every single word over the loud commotion of the ballroom. "You said I was only useful for running errands and cleaning up the messes at this party." I reminded her, my tone dropping to a freezing whisper. "Well, the small errand I ran today was providing the federal government with the master banking tokens that just sent your fraudulent husband to federal prison. I would say I cleaned up this mess perfectly." "How incredibly shameful for you, Chloe." She recoiled as if I had physically struck her, hands dropping away from my dress. She collapsed entirely against the hardwood floor, burying her face in her arms and releasing a loud, agonizing wail of absolute defeat. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not bend down to comfort her. I simply turned my back on the golden child and the ashes of her stolen kingdom. Julian stepped closer, his presence, a warm, solid shield against the toxic chaos of my past. He did not say a word, he just offered me his arm. I looped my hand through his, feeling the heavy platinum chain of my engagement ring resting securely against my skin. We began to walk toward the exit. My mother called my name, her voice weak and terrified, begging me to come back and fix the disaster they had created. My father finally looked up, his eyes full of belated, useless regret. But I did not turn around. I did not stop walking. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open for us, parting like a curtain at the end of a long, exhausting play. We stepped out into the freezing city night. The air was crisp and incredibly clean. A fleet of black federal vehicles and flashing blue police cruisers surrounded the restaurant entrance, their sirens blaring loudly into the darkness, signaling the absolute end of the Bennett family empire. I walked away from them without a single ounce of hesitation. I was leaving behind the people who had viewed my unconditional love as a weakness to be exploited. From this moment forward, I was choosing myself. I was walking into a beautiful, unwritten future with a man who valued my brilliant mind and my unbroken spirit. I was finally truly free. It has been exactly 3 months since that spectacular night at Le Petit Chateau. The federal justice system moves with a terrifying and absolute efficiency when the evidence is handed over in a perfectly encrypted digital package. Trent did not even try to fight the charges in court. His expensive defense attorneys took one single look at the master banking tokens, the offshore routing numbers, and the hidden video surveillance footage I had provided. They immediately advised him to take a plea deal to avoid a much harsher penalty. Standing before a federal judge, Trent was stripped of his custom-tailored suit and his arrogant smirk. He was sentenced to 10 full years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The man who used to brag about his massive corporate acquisitions to our entire church congregation is now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He will spend the next decade of his life completely isolated from the luxurious world he tried to build with stolen capital. He is locked away in a concrete cell where no amount of smooth talking can save him. The financial ruin of the Bennett family was absolute and completely irreversible. Because my father, Richard, was officially listed as a willing accomplice in the money laundering network, the federal government seized absolutely everything they owned. The sprawling suburban estate they loved to flaunt to their wealthy neighbors was foreclosed upon and sold at a federal auction to restitute the stolen funds. The luxury vehicles, the expensive jewelry, and the designer furniture were all confiscated in the middle of the day, while the entire neighborhood watched. My parents were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They were forced to move into a cramped, drafty, and run-down apartment on the far edge of the city. My mother, Patricia, the woman who used to sneer at my cheap clothes and treat me like a hired servant, now has to clip paper coupons just to afford basic groceries. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my father spends his days sitting in a cheap plastic lawn chair on a tiny concrete balcony. He stares blankly at a brick wall across the alley, entirely broken by the realization that his fraudulent legacy has been reduced to absolute ashes. They built their comfortable life on my silence and my sacrifices, and now they have to live with the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. As for my younger sister, Chloe, the reality of losing her golden child status was a brutal and humiliating awakening. Without Trent's stolen money, and without my parents' financial shield to protect her, she had to face the real world for the very first time in her pampered life. She lost her beautiful mansion in the gated community. She lost her designer wardrobe and her expensive sports car. Desperate to pay her mounting personal debts, and with absolutely no marketable skills to fall back on, she was forced to take a job as a cashier at a local discount supermarket. The woman who used to stand in front of 30 wealthy guests and openly mock me for driving an old car now spends her days scanning barcodes and bagging groceries for minimum wage. Her entire identity was built on feeling superior to me. Now she has to wear a scratchy polyester uniform and smile politely at impatient strangers just to survive the month. She finally learned that being the favorite child is not a magical shield against reality. While their world completely collapsed, my new life was just beginning to bloom in the most beautiful way imaginable. Julian and I did not want a massive, flashy wedding. We had both seen enough toxic theatrical performances to last a lifetime. Instead, we flew to Italy and held a profoundly intimate and private wedding ceremony at a historic stone villa overlooking the sparkling waters of Lake Como. There were no fake toasts, no manipulative relatives, and absolutely no members of the Bennett family in attendance. I stood under a canopy of fresh white roses wearing a beautiful custom silk gown and married the man who had seen my true worth when I was just a terrified accountant in a thrift store blazer. Today, I am no longer the invisible workhorse of a corrupt family business. I am the Chief Financial Officer of Julian's Global Logistics Corporation. I sit in a massive glass office on the top floor of a skyscraper, managing a billion-dollar portfolio, making crucial decisions that shape international trade. I am powerful, I am respected, and most importantly, I am deeply and unconditionally loved by a man who treats me as an equal partner. I spent 35 years of my life believing that love was something you could earn by sacrificing your own happiness. I thought if I just worked hard enough and gave them everything I had, they would eventually see my value. But I learned the hardest lesson of all. Love is not a transaction, and it is not a reward for being useful. You should never shrink back just to let toxic people in your family feel bigger. When they take your sacrifices for granted, you have to let them experience life without you. Setting firm boundaries is not betrayal, and saying no is never selfish. You deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your light, not people who constantly try to extinguish it to hide their own darkness. Have you ever had to set tough boundaries with your family? Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to let me know where and when you are watching this video. Your support motivates me to continue telling stories of seeking justice. Always remember to choose yourself because you are entirely worth it.